The crowd at Red Hollow's stage depot went quiet the moment Sheriff Dale Pruitt stepped forward, blocking Elara Voss's path before she'd taken 3 steps off the coach. He didn't bother lowering his voice. Lord Almighty. He turned to the men standing behind him, ranch hands, merchants, 3 women in bonnets who had come specifically to see this. They sent Bram Colter, a heifer. Laughter cracked through the crowd like a whip. A child pointed. One of the bonnet women covered her mouth but didn't bother covering her eyes. Elara stood on the wooden platform with her small suitcase held in both hands, the dust still settling around her boots, and she did not look away. She had learned young that looking away only encouraged them, so she held her chin level, and she breathed, and she let the laughter wash over her the way cold water washes over a stone, surrounding it completely, touching every surface, and changing nothing. She had survived worse than a sheriff with a big mouth and an audience. What she had not survived, not yet, was the question of what came next. If you have ever stood in a place where every single person around you decided in the first 3 seconds that you did not belong, then you already know what Elara Voss was carrying when she stepped off that stage. And if you have never stood in that place, count yourself fortunate, because that particular kind of loneliness, the kind that happens in public, surrounded by people, is the sharpest kind there is. This is her story. Stay with it until the end because it will surprise you. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Stories like this one keep coming, and you won't want to miss what's ahead. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far this has traveled. Now, Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory 1882, and a woman who refused to disappear. The stage had been 3 days out of Cheyenne, and Elara had spent most of it wedged against the window on the left side, watching the landscape flatten and then rise and then flatten again into something that felt less like country and more like a warning. 2 other passengers, a dry goods salesman named Hector who smelled of camphor, and a young man returning home from somewhere he clearly regretted, had not spoken to her after the first hour. She had grown accustomed to that. People looked at her, made their calculations, and then looked away and stayed away. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. From the time she was 9 years old and already broader than most of the boys in her school in Cincinnati, she had understood that her body was going to be the first thing anyone ever said about her. Sometimes it was the last thing, too. She was tall and wide-shouldered and solid in the way that good furniture is solid, built for endurance rather than elegance, and the world had spent 26 years making sure she knew it considered this a deficiency. Her mother had died when Elara was 14. Her father had remarried within a year, a thin, nervous woman named Constance, who had 3 thin, nervous daughters, and who made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that Elara's presence in the household was a kind of embarrassment. She had left at 18 with $30 she'd earned from taking in laundry, and a letter of recommendation from the headmistress of the school where she'd worked as a kitchen assistant. She had spent the next 8 years cooking in boarding houses, learning everything she could from every cook willing to teach her, and building a life that was small and hard and entirely her own. The advertisement had appeared in a Chicago newspaper in the spring of 1882. Widower rancher in Wyoming Territory, 2 young children, seeks capable woman willing to build a life on the frontier. Must be hardy, patient, and unafraid of hard work. Write to Colter Ranch, Red Hollow, Wyoming. She had written the letter 3 times before she sent one. The first 2 she threw away because they sounded either desperate or dishonest. The third one she wrote as plainly as she knew how. She said she was 26, that she had no family of consequence, that she had spent 8 years cooking and managing households, and she knew how to stretch $1 and preserve meat and keep a kitchen clean enough to eat off the floor. She said she was not afraid of hard work because she had never known anything else. She said she understood that marriage to a stranger was a risk and that she was willing to take it because the alternative, another decade of boarding houses and other people's kitchens, felt like a slower kind of disappearing. She did not mention her size. She had considered it and decided against it, not because she was ashamed, but because she had found in her experience that people who could not see past a body to the person inside it were not worth the warning. Bram Colter had written back in 12 days. His letter was short. It said he had read her letter twice, that he needed someone capable and steady, more than he needed someone pretty, and that if she was willing to make the journey, he would have someone meet her at the stage. She had taken the letter as something like a promise. She was reconsidering that now. Sheriff Pruitt had not moved from her path. He was a lean man in his 50s with a mustache that had probably been impressive 20 years ago, and eyes that had the particular flatness of a man who had never once been challenged on anything. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked her up and down one more time, with the careful thoroughness of someone pricing livestock. "You're the one Colter sent for?" he said. "I am." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Huh." He turned back to the crowd. "Bram's either gone blind or gone soft. I can't decide which is worse." The laughter again, louder this time. A boy of about 12 mimicked a waddling walk behind her. One of the bonnet women leaned toward another and said something Elara couldn't hear over the noise. And the second woman laughed so hard she had to put her hand on the first woman's arm to keep her balance. Elara stood where she was. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of crying in public a long time ago. Not because crying was weakness, but because crying in front of people like this gave them something they wanted. And she had stopped giving people like this what they wanted. She breathed slowly through her nose, and she waited, and she held her suitcase with both hands, and she did not look away from Sheriff Pruitt's face. It was a large man's shadow that finally moved across her, blocking the sun. She heard him before she saw him fully. The sound of boots on the platform boards, deliberate and unhurried, the sound of someone who did not move quickly because they had never needed to. Then he was beside her, and even by the generous standards of a tall woman, he was enormous. Bram Colter was the kind of tall that made other tall men feel ordinary 6 feet and 9 inches of Wyoming rancher, with hands the size of frying pans and shoulders so wide he had to turn slightly sideways to come through most doorways. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent their lives outdoors, not so much aged as carved. He had a dark beard cut close, and dark eyes that did not move from Sheriff Pruitt. "Dale," he said, "just the one word, no heat in it." No particular expression. The sheriff's posture shifted. "Not much, just enough, Bram," Pruitt said, and the easiness in his voice had tightened slightly, the way a rope tightens when weight is added to it. "Just welcoming your—" "I heard you welcoming her," Bram said. The crowd had gone quieter. Not silent. There were still murmurs at the edges, but the loud, comfortable quality of the laughter had changed into something more careful. Bram did not look at Elara yet. He stepped around her just one step so that he was standing between her and Pruitt. He still hadn't raised his voice. "You want to move, Dale, or you want to stand there a while longer?" Pruitt moved. There was no dramatic moment in it. The sheriff just stepped aside and found something interesting to look at in the middle distance, and the crowd redistributed itself, and the boy who had been mimicking her walk discovered something absorbing about his own boots. Bram Colter turned and looked at Elara directly for the first time. His eyes did not move down and then back up the way most people's did. He looked at her face. "Elara Voss," he said. "Yes. I'm Bram Colter. I apologize for that." He nodded toward where Pruitt was standing. "That's not the welcome you deserved." She looked at him for a moment, trying to read him. She had learned to read people quickly. It was a survival skill, and what she saw in Bram Colter's face was not pity, which she had expected, and not embarrassment, which she had also expected, and not the particular awkward reassessment she'd seen on others' faces when they realized the woman in front of them was not what they'd imagined. What she saw was something closer to tiredness. A man who was tired of his town behaving badly and tired of having to manage it. "Thank you," she said, for she stopped. He shook his head slightly. "My wagon's over here." That was the beginning of it. The ride out to the Colter ranch took nearly an hour on roads that were more intention than fact, and for most of it they did not speak. Bram drove and Elara sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the territory open up around them in the late afternoon light. All brown grass and hard sky and distance that seemed to go on until it forgot itself. She was used to silence, had spent most of her life in it, but this was a different quality of silence. Not hostile, not awkward. Exactly, more like two people who both understood that small talk was a kind of performance neither of them was in the mood for. Finally she said, "How old are your children?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Eli's 11, Rose is 6. How long has it been since their mother died?" A pause, not a long one, but she noticed it. 14 months. "I'm sorry, so am I." Another pause. "Eli, he's angry. I want you to know that before you get there. Not bad angry, just he's got nowhere to put it, so it comes out sideways." She nodded. She understood sideways anger. She had spent most of her childhood surrounded by it. "And Rose?" He was quiet for longer this time. She watched his hands on the reins, those enormous hands, handling the leather with a kind of careful precision that surprised her. "Rose stopped eating regular about 4 months ago. She eats enough to keep herself up, but barely. She doesn't talk much. She liked to sing before." He stopped as though he'd said more than he intended to. "The doctor in Red Hollow says there's nothing physically wrong. And you believe him?" He looked at her then, just briefly before looking back at the road. "I believe he's right that it's not her body. Past that, he wasn't much use." Sarah said nothing for a moment. She filed the information away and thought about it carefully. A child who had lost her mother and stopped eating. A child who used to sing. "I won't push her," Elara said. "What? Whatever I try with Rose, I won't push her. Children know when they're being managed. It makes things worse." He seemed to consider this. "Most women I've talked to say you just need to be firm about mealtimes. Most women I've met have never had the experience of wanting to disappear, Elara said, and immediately regretted saying it, because it revealed something she hadn't meant to reveal that soon. But Bram didn't push it. He nodded once, slowly as if the statement made some kind of sense to him that he wasn't going to examine out loud. All right, he said. We'll do it your way first. She wasn't sure what to make of a man who agreed that readily. In her experience, agreement that came fast usually came shallow. She decided to wait and see. The ranch came into view as the light was going gold and slanted, and her first thought was that it was larger than she'd imagined, and her second thought was that it was more tired. The main house was solid good timber, properly built, but the porch railing had a gap where a board had come loose and not been replaced. And the kitchen garden she could see from the wagon road was fighting weeds it was currently losing against. And there was a general quality to the place of things being maintained by one person, working harder than anyone should have to. 2 ranch hands were moving around the yard, doing evening chores, and they both stopped when the wagon came through the gate. One of them, a young man with red hair and the specific face of someone who enjoyed having opinions, looked at Elara the same way Pruitt had. Less openly, but the same direction. She noticed. She always noticed. Bram climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side in a way that was not quite offering help and not quite not offering it. More like being present in case it was needed. She climbed down herself. She had been climbing in and out of wagons without assistance for 20 years. That's Cody, Bram said, nodding toward the red-haired one. And that's Pete. The other man, older, with the careful face of someone who kept his thoughts to himself. Pete nodded at her. Cody did not. Ma'am, Pete said. Cody said, huh. It wasn't a word, exactly. But it meant everything it was meant to mean. Elara looked at him for exactly as long as it took her to decide he wasn't worth the energy, and then she looked at the house. I'd like to start with the kitchen, she said to Bram. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty she'd seen dirty, and this wasn't that. But it had the disordered quality of a space that had been run by someone who knew where everything was, and then wasn't there anymore. And everyone since had been improvising. Things were stored without logic. The larder had duplicate items in 3 different places, and gaps that suggested no one was keeping a proper count. There was a good cast-iron stove that had been cleaned but not seasoned properly, and a bread oven that looked like it hadn't been used in months. She spent the first 40 minutes just looking, opening cabinets, checking what was there, noting what was missing, trying to understand what the kitchen had been before and what it would need to become. She heard the children before she saw them. A boy's voice from the hallway higher than she expected for 11. Still losing the battle with the voice change saying, clearly enough for her to hear, is she really going to stay? And a man's voice lower, yeah, she's pause. She's really big, Pa, Eli. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Don't say it again. A longer pause. Then is she going to sleep in Mama's room? She didn't hear the answer to that one. Bram must have moved them further down the hall. She turned back to the cabinet she'd been cataloging and continued her count. 14 pounds of cornmeal, no oats, 3 jars of preserved tomatoes. Not enough salt. When she finally turned around, there was a small girl standing in the kitchen doorway. Rose Colter was 6 years old and looked younger. She was slight in the way of children who had grown up outdoors. Not fragile exactly, but fine-boned, with the particular transparency of a child who has recently been ill. Her hair was dark and hung in 2 braids that needed attending to. She was wearing a dress that was clean but had been let out at the hem, probably twice. Her eyes were dark like her father's, and she was looking at Elara with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile, just watching. Elara did not say hello. She did not say anything. She turned back to the cabinet and continued counting. After a moment, she heard small feet move slightly into the room. She kept her back to the child and kept counting, out loud and quietly, so there was something to hear. 42, she said, counting dried beans into her hand. 43, 44. She heard Rose come a step closer. She did not turn around. 47, 48. She tipped the beans back into the jar and set it down and moved to the next shelf. Do you know how many potatoes are in the root cellar? Silence, then very small a lot, more than 30? A beet. I think so, good. She made a note on the paper she'd found and began writing. I'm going to make a list. Could you do something for me? Another silence, longer this time. What? Could you find out if there's any cinnamon? I couldn't see it, but I thought I could smell it somewhere. She heard the child's feet on the floor. The sound of a small hand opening a cabinet lower than she could have reached comfortably herself. Then here she turned then slowly and took the small glass jar Rose was holding out. She made a point of opening it and smelling it properly, as though this were a serious matter requiring her full attention. That's good cinnamon, she said. Thank you. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to the doorway and stood there, watching, while Elara went back to her list. Dinner that night was improvised, because she hadn't had time to plan anything. and it was simple: salt pork and beans with cornbread, the latter slightly overdone because she didn't know the stove yet. She served it without apology. 3 ranch hands ate at the long table: Cody and Pete and a third man named Walt, who was somewhere in his 60s and seemed to find the whole situation more interesting than anything else currently happening in his life. Eli sat at the end of the table and ate in silence. Bram sat at the head. Rose ate less than half of what was on her plate and put her fork down and looked at the table. Elara watched Rose without watching her. She said nothing about the unfinished food. She asked Pete whether the northeast pasture fence needed attention. She'd noticed it from the road, and Pete confirmed it did. And a conversation started about fencing that had nothing to do with Rose or eating, and Rose sat at the table and watched the adults talk and did not leave. It was something. It was not much, but it was something, Cody said. At the end of it, while the others were clearing dishes, no offense, but my mother made better cornbread. Elara stacked 2 plates together and looked at him. Then she taught you how to make it, she said. You're welcome to. Walt made a sound into his coffee that might have been a laugh. Cody did not offer to make cornbread. The first week was the kind of hard that doesn't announce itself dramatically but grinds. She was up before 5 every morning to have the stove going before the ranch hands needed their breakfast. The kitchen was cold in a way that seeped into her joints, and she learned quickly that the flue on the bread oven had a tendency to stick, and she burned her left hand twice before she figured out the correct approach to it. The laundry was staggering. The accounts, which Bram handed over to her without ceremony on her 3rd day, were in worse shape than she had expected. Not disastrously, but close enough that she spent 2 evenings going through them, line by line, before she understood what had happened. Materials had been ordered twice. Labor costs had drifted. Someone had paid full price for things that should have been negotiated. She did not present this as a criticism. She went to Bram on the 5th day and said, I found some places in the accounts where we could recover some money if you want me to show you. He was mending a harness at the time. He looked up. How much? Enough that it would matter, she said. He put down the harness. Show me. She showed him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done he was quiet for a while, and then he said, I should have caught that. You were managing other things, she said. That's not an excuse. She shrugged. No, but it's a reason. He looked at her with that same quality of assessment she'd noticed in the wagon, looking at her face, not her body. You're straightforward, he said. I appreciate that. I found it saves time, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Eli was harder. He was a boy who had made himself useful out of grief, taking on tasks that were too large for him and doing them imperfectly and stubbornly, unwilling to accept help from anyone, because accepting help would mean admitting he couldn't do it himself, which would mean admitting he was still a child, which would mean admitting he needed his mother. She understood this because she had been a version of it herself. On her 8th day, she found him trying to repair the section of porch railing that had been broken. He was using the wrong size nails, and he knew it. She could tell from the set of his jaw, but he had committed to the project, and he was going to see it through regardless. She watched him for a moment. Then she said, Do you know where your father keeps the proper nails? The bigger flatheads? He looked at her with the particular suspicion of an 11-year-old who suspects he is being managed. Workshop, he said. Would you mind getting me some? I want to fix the cabinet hinge in the kitchen, and I can't find the right size. He was gone for 3 minutes and came back with a small handful of nails. He held them out without looking at her, then looked at the railing, then looked at his own nails, and said, These would work better for that, too, she said. He hesitated. Then, with the studied casualness of a child pretending not to care about the outcome, I could show you where they go. I'd be grateful, she said. She watched from the porch while he pulled the wrong nails out and started again with the right ones. She didn't offer advice. She didn't praise him. She just watched, and when he was done, she said, That's solid, and went back inside. He didn't say anything. But the next morning he came to breakfast 5 minutes earlier than usual and sat down without being called. She counted that. 12 days in, Cody found a reason to question her in front of the others. He did it at dinner, which she suspected was intentional. He waited until everyone had served themselves and then looked at his plate with exaggerated consideration and said, What is this exactly? This the same thing we had Tuesday? Similar, she said. The beans are different. Right. He pushed a piece of salt pork around. My friend's ranch, the cook they have, she does a proper stew every Sunday. Beef, actual beef. There's no beef, Elara said. I know, because I did the ordering list last week. When there's beef, there'll be stew. There was beef 3 weeks ago, Cody said. I'm just saying the last cook is not here, Bram said from the end of the table. Cody looked at him, looked back at his plate, said nothing more. But she heard him that night, talking to Pete in the yard, his voice not quite low enough. I'm telling you, she's not going to make it 3 months. What's Bram thinking, bringing her out here? And Pete, quieter. Finish your work. I'm serious, Pete.
Cody.
Pete's voice had an edge in it. Finish your work. She lay in her room that night. It was a good room, not Bram's wife's room, but a proper guest room. And she listened to the wind come off the mountains. And she thought about Cody's voice, and the laughter in Red Hollow and Sheriff Pruitt's eyes, and the way the bonnet women had leaned together to share the joke of her. She had been here before. Not here exactly. But this, the specific experience of arriving somewhere and being immediately and thoroughly decided against. She had been here many times. She pressed her palms flat against the quilt and breathed. She was not going to leave. She had not come all this way to leave. She had not come all this way to give Cody Walker the satisfaction of being right, or to give Sheriff Pruitt the amusement of watching her go, or to prove once again, to everyone who had ever looked at her and made their calculations, that their calculations were correct. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Rose, about the half-eaten plate, about the small girl who used to sing. Then she turned over and slept. It was on the 16th day that the thing with the stove happened. She had been working with the bread oven for 2 weeks and thought she had figured it out, and she had not. The bread rose wrong and then fell, and what came out was dense and sour in a way that had nothing to do with the recipe, and she understood then that the oven had some structural problem she hadn't identified. She pulled the loaves out and looked at them and said a word that she would not have said in front of the children, and stood in the kitchen, feeling something between fury and despair. Pete appeared in the doorway. He looked at the loaves. He said, "There's a crack in the oven wall, left side, near the back. Been there since last winter." She stared at him. "You knew that?" He looked mildly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Colter knew how to work around it. Rotated everything at exactly 15 minutes, I should have said." She looked at the ruined loaves for a long moment. Then she looked at Pete. "Thank you for telling me now," she said, and meant it. He nodded. Looked like he wanted to say something else. Finally said, "You're doing all right, ma'am. In case that's useful to know." It was. She didn't say so out loud, but it was. She rebuilt the bread from scratch, rotating it 15 minutes, and it came out almost right. Not perfect. Better than the day before. She served it at dinner and said nothing about the ordeal. No one asked. At the end of the 3rd week, she went to Bram with the list she'd been building since she arrived. It was a list of what the ranch needed. Not what she needed, but what the ranch needed. Repairs that were deferred. Materials that should have been ordered already. A revised schedule for the root cellar that would stretch the winter stores further. She had written it carefully and without embellishment. He read it slowly, twice. Then he set it down on the table between them. "This would cost money," he said. "Some of it would. Some of it's just organization." She pointed to 3 items on the list. "Those 3 things cost nothing except time. They'd save you money by March." He looked at the list again. The lamp between them was low. She'd meant to trim it earlier and forgotten, and it gave the kitchen a dim, specific quality, like something underwater. "Elara," he said. He didn't say anything else for a moment.
What?
He stopped. Started again. "I'm not good at saying things that aren't—"
Another stop.
He pressed the flat of his hand on the paper. "I think I made the right choice," he said, writing back. "Asking you to come." She looked at him across the table. His face was difficult to read in the low light. She was not sure entirely what she was looking at. "We don't know that yet," she said. "Give it another month." He looked at her. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Push things out. Don't let anything settle," she considered this. "It's a habit," she said. "Not a bad one," he said. "But you could let some things settle." She didn't know what to say to that. She picked up the lamp and trimmed the wick, and the light improved considerably, and the moment changed quality, and neither of them said anything else about settling. But she thought about it afterward. Lying in her room with the mountain wind outside, and the lamp out and the ranch quiet around her, she thought about what it would mean to let something settle, to stop waiting for the floor to fall through, to believe even provisionally that a place could hold you without eventually deciding to put you back down. She didn't know yet if this place would do that. She had no way of knowing. But it was the first time in a long time that she had considered the question without the answer, feeling entirely hopeless. Outside, the wind came off the mountains and crossed the yard and pressed itself against the house walls and found no purchase, and the house held, and the woman inside it lay still in the dark and thought about what it might mean to stay. The 4th week began with snow. Not a blizzard, just the first real snow of the season, coming down in the early morning hours while the ranch was still dark and quiet, laying itself over the yard in a thin, even sheet that muffled everything and made the world feel smaller and closer than it had been. Elara was already up when it started. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched it come down and thought about the root cellar inventory she'd updated 2 days ago and whether she'd been optimistic about the turnips. She probably had been optimistic about the turnips. She added it to the mental list she kept. The one that had no paper version, because some things were better held in her head where they couldn't be argued with, and she turned back to the stove and began measuring out the oats she'd finally gotten Bram to order on her 3rd week here. The oats had been a small argument, not a fight, exactly, but a conversation with some friction in it. Bram had been buying cornmeal because that was what the previous supplier carried most of, and she had pointed out that oats were more versatile and held longer, and the children would eat them better, and he had said he'd think about it, and she had let 2 days pass and then mentioned it again. And on the 3rd mention, he had added oats to the order without further discussion. She counted that as a win. She did not mention it again. The ranch hands came in for breakfast in stages, the way they always did Pete first, because Pete was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 4:30. Then Walt, who moved slowly in cold weather, and blamed it on a shoulder he'd broken years ago that had healed crooked. Then Cody, who always came in last, and always managed to make it seem like a statement. Cody looked at the pot of oatmeal on the table. He looked at Elara. He opened his mouth. Pete said, "It's good. Sit down, Cody." Cody sat down. He ate the oatmeal without comment, which she counted as a separate small win. Eli came down at 6, which was late for him, and she could tell from the set of his face that he'd slept badly. He was at the age where bad sleep made everything worse, and he had not yet learned to manage this, so the bad sleep came out as a general grievance against the world. He sat down and looked at the oatmeal and said again, "It's different today," she said. "There's honey." He looked at the honey jar like it had personally offended him. Then he spooned some on, because he was 11 and he was not going to refuse honey, regardless of his current feelings about oatmeal. And he ate in silence, with the particular loud quality of someone who wants you to know they are tolerating, rather than enjoying. Rose came in last, as she always did, moving quietly along the wall the way she did when she wasn't sure of her welcome. She sat in her usual chair, the one slightly pulled back from the table, as though she was keeping the option open to leave, and accepted the bowl Elara set in front of her without looking up. Elara did not watch her eat. She turned back to the stove and began cleaning up. Behind her, she heard the small, specific sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a bowl. She kept her face toward the stove. That was the beginning of the 4th week. The trouble with Cody came to a head on a Thursday. She had expected it sooner, if she was honest. He had been building toward something since her first day. The small comments, the theatrical sighs at dinner, the way he talked to Pete in the yard at a volume calculated to be heard through the kitchen window. She had filed it away and let it accumulate and waited, because she had learned that confronting something too early only pushed it underground where it got worse, and that some things needed to be allowed to surface on their own terms. It surfaced on a Thursday in the supply room off the kitchen when she was doing the weekly inventory. She heard him come in behind her. She did not turn around. "Can I help you with something?" she said. "I'm just saying," he said, which was how he always began his sentences when he had already decided what he was going to say regardless of what anyone else contributed, that the way things were run before worked fine. She made a note in her ledger. "The accounts were $17 short in August," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. "That's not the point. What's the point?" She heard him shift his weight. He was young. She'd placed him at 23, 24. And young men who were used to having their opinions matter in a room sometimes struggled when they didn't. "The point is that you're changing things. Things that didn't need changing." She turned around then. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at Pruitt on her first day, with the same measured quality, not aggressive, just clear. "The kitchen schedule has the ranch hands eating 30 minutes earlier so they can start the east pasture work in better light," she said. "That was Bram's suggestion based on the winter schedule. The accounts issue was something I identified in the first week. The meal changes are because the budget I was given works better with the current suppliers." She paused. "Which of those things would you like to change back?" He stared at her. "I'm asking seriously," she said. "If there's something that's not working, I'd like to know. That's useful to me." He had the look of someone who had prepared for a different kind of conversation, one where he said his piece and she either backed down or got flustered and was now recalibrating. He said, "It's not about any one thing." "Then what is it about?" A long pause. He looked at the floor and then at the wall and then briefly at her face. "You don't belong here," he said. "I'm sorry, but that's the truth. This is hard country. The women who make it here are. They're a certain kind." She looked at him for a moment. "What kind is that?" she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. "Because I'd like to understand," she said, keeping her voice even, keeping it light, even though she could feel the words land the way they always landed, right in the same place they always went to, that specific spot between her ribs where all the cruelty she'd absorbed over 26 years had deposited itself like sediment. "What kind of woman belongs here? Describe her for me." He couldn't. She watched him try and fail. And the failing was its own kind of answer, because what he had been about to say was not actually about hardiness or capability or the demands of frontier life. What he had been about to say was about her size, about the way she looked, about the same calculation everyone from Cincinnati to Red Hollow had been making since she was 9 years old. And he knew it, and she knew it, and the knowing of it by both of them simultaneously created a silence that was too large to talk over. "I don't have a problem with your work," he said finally. It came out smaller than anything else he'd said. "Good," she said. She turned back to her ledger. "Then we don't have a problem." She heard him leave. She kept her hand steady on the pencil and finished the line she was writing and turned the page. Her hand was only slightly shaking. She considered that adequate. What she had not told Cody, and what she did not tell anyone, was that she had her own doubts. Not about her capability. She knew what she could do, had always known, had spent 8 years proving it in other people's kitchens. But about this specific thing, this arrangement, whether a marriage built from correspondence and desperation could become something that held two people together through a Wyoming winter, let alone a life. Bram was not easy to read. She had decided this was not a character flaw but simply a fact about him, the same way the sticky flu was a fact about the bread oven, something to understand and work with rather than resent. He was consistent up before her, working until dark, coming in for meals and eating without complaint, spending an hour with the children before bed, then reading in the parlor until the lamp oil ran low. He did not bring his difficulties into the kitchen. He managed whatever he was feeling in some internal place she did not have access to. She respected this. She was not sure she liked it. On a Friday night at the end of her 4th week, she came into the parlor to return a book she'd borrowed from his shelf. She'd asked, he'd seemed surprised she asked. She'd taken it as confirmation that the previous person in her position had not been a reader, and she found him sitting with a letter in his hands, not reading it, just holding it. He didn't hear her come in, or if he did, he gave no indication, and she stopped in the doorway and took in the quality of his stillness. She recognized it. It was the stillness of a person who has found the one place where no one is watching and has allowed themselves to be something other than competent. She set the book on the shelf as quietly as she could and started to leave. "You can come in," he said. She came in. She sat in the other chair, the smaller one that had probably been his wife's, and she looked at the fire because it seemed more courteous than looking at him. "From her family," he said. "Her mother, asking after the children." She didn't say anything. "I don't know what to tell her," he said. "Rose isn't—" He stopped. "I don't know how to explain to a grandmother that her granddaughter isn't eating, that she used to sing and now she doesn't. I don't know how to write that in a way that—" He pressed the letter between both palms. "That doesn't sound like something I failed at." Elara looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell her Rose is being looked after, that you've brought someone in who's paying close attention to her. That's the truth." He looked at her. "Is it? Are you? I don't see you. I mean, I've watched you at meals and you don't seem to—" "I do it quietly," she said. "I'm not going to sit across the table and stare at the child every meal. That would make it worse." She paused. "Yesterday she told me where the cinnamon was. Tuesday she asked me what I was making for dinner. Wednesday she stayed in the kitchen for an hour, watching me work without being asked to. She let that sit for a moment. She's watching to see if it's safe," she said. "I'm making it safe." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to say anything. "Then how do you know how to do that?" She kept her eyes on the fire. "Because someone needed to do it for me once," she said. And nobody did. The fire moved. Wind came against the window. He folded the letter slowly and set it on the table beside him. "I'll write back tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. She stood up. "Good night, Bram." "Good night," he said. She went down the hall to her room and lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the fact that she had just told him something true and that it had not broken anything and that this was worth noting. The thing about Rose happened at the end of the 5th week. It did not happen dramatically. Elara had thought, if it happened, it would feel significant in the moment. It's clear, before and after. But that was not how it went. She had been making bread on a Wednesday afternoon, the good batch, the one that came out right, because she'd remembered the 15-minute rotation and the crack in the back wall of the oven. Rose had drifted into the kitchen in the particular way she did, like weather moving from one room to another, and had settled herself on the stool near the window without being invited and without explanation. She did this 3 or 4 times a week now. She never said she was coming, and she never said why, and Elara had stopped pretending there needed to be a reason. She was working the dough when Rose said from the stool, in a voice so quiet Elara almost missed it, "My mama made bread." Elara kept working the dough. She did not stop. She did not look up. "Kind," she said, a pause. "White bread, with the top shiny." "Egg wash," Elara said, brushed on at the end. "Makes it shiny and brown." Another pause. "Do you do that?" "Sometimes, when I have eggs to spare." She turned the dough and pressed the heel of her hand into it. "I could show you how if you wanted." The longest pause yet. Then, okay. She did not make a thing of it. She did not praise the child for talking about her mother, or reward her for engaging, or do any of the things a person does when they feel like they've finally gotten through to something. She just nodded and kept working the dough and said, "Next batch, then." Rose stayed on the stool for another hour. She did not speak again, but she watched. The quality of her watching was different from before, less guarded, more like actual curiosity. Elara filed it away. Said nothing about it at dinner. Said nothing about it to Bram. But that night, after the children were in bed, she sat in the kitchen with her ledger and her pencil, and the sound of the ranch settling around her, and she felt something she could not quite name. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something in the direction of hope, without being so bold as to call itself that. It was Walt who told her about the gathering. He mentioned it sideways, the way Walt communicated most things, with an air of bringing up something he'd been thinking about for a while, and had finally decided to mention because it couldn't wait. They were in the yard on a cold Monday morning, and he was mending a fence post while she was carrying kitchen waste to the compost, and he said, "Colter Ranch does a big gathering every year. December. Rest of the county comes out." She set down the compost bucket. How big? 40, 50 people, sometimes more. He drove a nail. Martha Colter, that was Bram's wife. She always did a big dinner for it. 3 or 4 dishes, tables set outside under lanterns. He paused. It's how people know where things stand with the ranch. She thought about this. How long has it been a tradition? Since before Bram's father died. 30 years, maybe. Walt looked at the fence post and then at her. I mention it because Bram probably won't. He's been thinking about canceling it. Why? Walt shrugged. He'd say it's too much to organize this year. What he means is he doesn't know how to do it without Martha. He drove another nail. But canceling it would be noticed. People would say the ranch is struggling. They're already saying it. She picked up the compost bucket. She thought about 40 people coming out to the Colter Ranch in December, about the tables under lanterns, about a tradition that had held the ranch's reputation for 30 years. When in December, she said, 3rd Saturday, that was 5 weeks away. She calculated. She had been doing that kind of calculation. What was possible in what amount of time, with what resources, for her entire adult life, and she was good at it. "I'll talk to Bram," she said. Walt looked at her with the careful expression he reserved for things he thought were important. "You sure you want to take that on?" he said. "The whole county's coming. They're going to be watching. They're already watching," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to his fence post. Bram's response to the gathering conversation was not what she expected. She had prepared for reluctance, the particular resistance of a man who was not ready to bring the outside world back to a house still full of grief. She sat across from him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and laid it out plainly. The tradition, the 30 years, what canceling it would communicate about the ranch, what doing it would communicate instead. He listened without interrupting, which was his habit, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long time. He pressed his thumb against a crack in the table. It was a large table, solid oak, with the particular marks of a table that had been the center of a family's life for years. She had repaired 3 of the chairs already. "It's a lot of work," he said. "Yes, for someone who's only been here 5 weeks. "I know what I'm doing," she said. Not defensively, just factually. He looked at her. "Martha spent 3 weeks on it every year. I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying it was her thing. She had it organized in ways I probably never understood." "Then I'll make it my thing," Elara said, "different ways." He studied her face. She had noticed he did this when he was making a decision. Not the quick assessment of someone who had already made up his mind, but the slower looking of someone who was actually trying to read something. "Why?" he said. She stopped. It was not a question she'd expected. "Why what? Why does it matter to you? You've been here 5 weeks. This is," he gestured vaguely, "this is a tradition I started with someone else, in a house that was hers before it was ever going to be yours. Why do you want to take that on?" It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 5 weeks, and she was not entirely sure how to answer it. She thought about Walt's face when he mentioned it, the careful weight of it. She thought about Rose on the stool watching the bread. She thought about Eli's nails in the porch railing. "Because the ranch is already mine," she said. "Not in a legal sense, but in the sense that I get up every morning and I run it, and I care what happens to it, and I am trying to make it better." That happened fast. "I didn't plan for it to happen fast." She paused. "And the gathering matters because it's how the county sees the ranch, and I don't want them to see it struggling. I don't want them to stop." "What?" he said. She met his eyes. "I don't want them to think you made a mistake, choosing me." He was very still for a moment. "Elara," he said. "I know how they talk about me," she said, in Red Hollow. "I'm not naive about that. I know what Pruitt said, and what the women at the stage said, and what they're probably still saying." She kept her voice level with the specific effort of someone who has had a lot of practice keeping their voice level. And I know that every one of those people is waiting to be proven right, waiting for me to at something in a way that confirms what they already decided. She let out a slow breath. I'd prefer not to give them the satisfaction. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face, not pity, closer to recognition. All right, he said. Do the gathering. I'll need a budget, she said immediately, because she had learned that agreements needed specifics attached before they had a chance to soften. He almost smiled again, closer this time. Write me a number. She wrote him a number that night that was honest and realistic, and about 15% lower than what she actually calculated she needed, because she intended to find the 15% herself through negotiation with suppliers and substitution of ingredients. And she did not want him to think she was extravagant. She had learned that being considered extravagant, for a woman like her, was not a neutral thing. He approved it in the morning without adjusting it, which she had not expected. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of her life, and she had lived a life that had not been short on hard things. She planned the menu in the second week of November 10 dishes, some of which she had made hundreds of times, and some of which she had made twice, and some of which she had never made at all but had read about, and was reasonably confident she could produce if she organized the preparation correctly. She wrote the preparation schedule in her ledger in 3 different colors of pencil: blue for things that could be done a week ahead, red for things that needed to happen in the final 2 days, black for the day of work that would require the stove and the bread oven and the outdoor fire pits she was going to need to build. She needed fire pits. She talked to Pete about fire pits. Pete built her 2, without comment, in the east side of the yard. She needed extra hands in the kitchen for the 2 preparation days. She had a conversation about this with Bram that was the closest they had come to an actual argument, not because he refused, but because he suggested she hire 2 of the women from town, and she had specific reasons for not wanting to do that. And the reasons were complicated to explain, without sounding either paranoid or petty. She explained them anyway. She said that the women from town who would be most qualified were also the women most likely to arrive with opinions about how it should be done, and whose kitchen it was, and whether Elara Voss had any business running a gathering that Martha Colter had always run, and that having that particular conversation in the middle of preparation week would cost her more than it would gain. Bram listened. He said, "So what do you want instead?" "Walt's wife," she said. "She's in Laramie, but she could come for the week. And Rose. Rose isn't, I know she's not a kitchen hand, but she wants to help. She told me yesterday. She asked if she could do the egg wash." He was quiet for a moment. "She asked you that?" "Yes." He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He said, "All right, I'll write to Walt's wife." She knew from the way he said it that the Rose part had mattered more to him than the practical planning, and she let him have that without making it explicit. Walt's wife was a compact, efficient woman named Dora, who arrived on a Thursday with a single bag and an air of someone who had been useful in difficult situations before and expected this to be more of the same. She assessed the kitchen in 10 minutes and offered 3 suggestions in the first hour, 2 of which Elara took and 1 of which she didn't, and they established a working relationship built on mutual competence that Elara found genuinely steadying. Cody watched Dora arrive from the barn doorway with the expression of someone recalculating. He did not make any comments about the preparation week. He helped carry in the additional supplies from the wagon without being asked. Eli, who had been watching the gathering preparations from a careful distance for 2 weeks, appeared in the kitchen doorway on the first preparation day and said, "Can I do something?" Elara looked at him. He looked back with the particular combination of pride and hope that 11-year-old boys try to hide under studied indifference. "The tables need setting up in the yard," she said. Walt said, "You know where the trestles are stored." "In the equipment barn," he said. "Second stall." "Then that's yours," she said. He disappeared. She heard him calling to Cody in the yard with the authority of someone who has been given a specific task and intends to execute it. Rose came to her at noon that day, wearing an apron 3 sizes too large that she had clearly found somewhere and put on herself, and stood in front of Elara with her hands at her sides and her chin up in a posture that was unmistakably her father's. "I'm ready," she said. Elara took her to the bread station and showed her the egg wash. Rose listened to every instruction with the focused attention of a child who is determined not to get it wrong. When she applied the first brush of wash to the first loaf, her hand was so careful, it was almost painfully careful, the way children are careful with things that matter to them. "Like that," she said. Elara looked at the loaf. "Exactly like that," she said. Rose looked at the shiny streak of egg wash on the bread crust. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, so quiet Elara almost missed it, "Mama would have done it the same." Elara looked at the loaves. She kept her face toward the bread. "That's a good way to do it," she said. Rose kept brushing. Dora, at the other end of the table, said nothing and kept her eyes on her own work, which was the right thing to do. Elara had decided in the first hour that Dora was a woman who understood which moments required silence, and she had not been wrong. By the night before the gathering, she was running on 4 hours of sleep, and the specific momentum of a project too large to stop. The food that could be prepared was prepared, covered, and stored in the root cellar, and the cold of the porch, and every cool surface available. The yard had been swept, and the tables set up, and the lanterns hung, and Eli had done the lanterns with more care than she had expected, climbing up on the fence posts and adjusting each one until they were even. Bram came into the kitchen at 10 o'clock that night, and found her standing at the stove going over her morning schedule for the 4th time. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "Soon." He came and stood beside her, and looked at the schedule she was holding. He said nothing for a while, then Elara. "What?" "It's going to be good," he said. She looked at the schedule. "You don't know that yet. I know enough," he said. She considered this. The kitchen was warm from a full day of cooking, and the smell of it, all the combined spices and bread and preserved things, was almost overwhelming in the best way, the way of a house that has been thoroughly inhabited. She thought about the boarding houses she'd spent 8 years in, the impersonal kitchens, the meals she'd made for people who did not know her name. "I need the stove at 4:30, she said. "I'll make sure no one's in here before 4:30, he said. "And the fire pits need to be going by 6. "I'll do the fire pits myself," he said. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she had to tilt her head, which still struck her as unusual. She was a tall woman, and almost no one was above her eye line. "You're not worried," she said, "about tomorrow." He thought about it. "About the food? No, about what people are going to say when they see it." "Probably." He paused. "About what people are going to say when they see you." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She held his gaze. "I can manage what people say." "I know you can," he said. "That's not what worries me." She understood what he meant. Not that she couldn't handle it, but that she shouldn't have to. That there was a difference between being capable of surviving something and that thing being acceptable. She had not had many people in her life who understood that distinction. "Thank you," she said. She was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for. He seemed to know because he nodded once and stepped back. 4:30, he said. 4:30, she confirmed. He went to bed. She stayed another 20 minutes with her schedule, and then put it down and looked at the kitchen around her. The clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the crack in the oven wall she had learned to work with, and she breathed in the smell of it. This kitchen that had been someone else's and was now, in the particular way that use and effort and care create ownership, genuinely hers. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the windows, cold and enormous and indifferent, and the lanterns Eli had hung in the yard moved slightly in the wind, and the ranch was quiet around her. And she stood in the kitchen that smelled of everything she had made and thought about tomorrow. Not with fear exactly, not with confidence exactly. With the specific, realistic, grounded feeling of someone who has done the preparation and knows that preparation is the only thing within their control, and has made peace with the fact that beyond that, you simply wait and see. She turned off the lamp and went to bed. She was at the stove by 4:23. Not because she was anxious, though she was, but because she had slept as long as her body would allow, and then woken into the specific alertness of someone who has too much to do to stay horizontal. She dressed in the dark, felt her way to the kitchen, and had the stove going 7 minutes before Bram came through the back door, with frost on his collar, and his breath making clouds in the cold air. He looked at the stove already burning. He looked at her. He did not say anything about the 4:30 agreement. "Fire pits," she said. "Going," he said. "Both of them." She handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. She had made it as soon as the stove was hot enough, and he took it with both hands and stood near the warmth and drank it while she began the first stage of the morning work. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the work itself wasn't already saying. By 5:30, Dora was in the kitchen. By 6, the first round of preparation was underway. The dishes that needed early heat, the sauces that needed time, the bread that had been started the night before, and needed to be shaped and set for its final rise. Rose appeared at 6:45 in her oversized apron, her hair still in sleep braids she hadn't bothered to redo, and took her place at the bread station without being summoned. Elara noted this and said nothing about it, and handed her the egg wash brush when the time came. Eli appeared at 7 and went directly to the yard to check the tables, which was not a task anyone had assigned him but which he had apparently decided was his. She heard him outside talking to Walt about the lantern positions in a tone that suggested he had opinions. Walt, to his credit, seemed to be listening. Cody came to the kitchen door at 7:30 and stood in it for a moment, looking at the organized chaos inside 3 people working, the heat, the smell of everything at once. He said, "Anything you need out here?" She looked up from what she was doing. It was the first time he had offered, the first time the offer had not carried any particular weight underneath it. "The long tables need the cloth," she said. They're folded in the parlor chest. He went and got them. She heard him and Eli arguing companionably about the correct way to straighten a tablecloth, and Eli winning, and this felt like something worth noting even if she didn't have time to think about it properly. The first guests arrived at noon. She had expected them earlier, honestly. When you have been waiting for a thing to begin, your sense of time distorts, and the last 2 hours of preparation had taken on a compressed, slightly unreal quality where she was aware of doing each task, but not entirely present for the doing of it, running on some combination of focus and momentum that would not be available to her again for several days. She heard the first wagon in the yard, the sound of it, the voices, and she did not stop what she was doing. She kept her hands on the pot she was tending and did not look up. Dora said, "First ones are here." "I know," Elara said. "You going to go out?" "After the sauce is set." She stirred once more and adjusted the temperature with the practiced judgment of someone who has spent enough time at a stove that the relationship is physical and instinctive rather than calculated. 5 minutes. Dora made a sound that was not quite approval, but was not quite not approval either, and went back to her station. The first guests were the Harmon family, 2 brothers, their wives, a collection of children, who immediately dispersed to whatever corners of the yard looked most interesting. Gerald Harmon, the elder brother, was a rancher of about 50 with the look of someone who had arrived with preformed opinions and intended to verify them. His wife, a narrow woman named Frances, who Elara had never met, but whose reputation as a person with excellent recall for other people's business had made it to her within the first week at the ranch, came in through the kitchen door behind her husband and stopped just inside. She looked at the kitchen, she looked at Elara, she looked at Dora, she looked back at the kitchen, the organized surfaces, the pots, the covered dishes on the far table. "Mrs. Colter," she said. It was the first time anyone from town had called her that, and the sound of it landed in a way Elara had not prepared for. She kept her face even. "Mrs. Harmon," she said, "please make yourself comfortable in the parlor. We'll have food out in about an hour." Frances Harmon's eyes moved across the kitchen one more time, taking inventory in a way that was practiced enough to look casual. Then she said, "It smells wonderful," and went into the parlor. Dora waited until the footsteps had faded and then said quietly, "That's a vote." "That's one person," Elara said. "Frances Harmon's opinion travels faster than the stage," Dora said. "Trust me, that's a vote." Elara considered and then returned her attention to the sauce. By 1 o'clock, there were 37 people on the Colter ranch. By 1:30, there were closer to 50, and the yard had the quality of a proper gathering, groups of men talking near the fire pits, children running between the tables, women moving between the kitchen and the yard with the particular purposefulness of people who are used to large-scale domestic events and are assessing how this one is being run. Elara had come out of the kitchen twice briefly, to check the outdoor fire setup, and to speak to Walt about the timing of the main courses. Both times she had felt the shift in conversation that happened when she walked through a crowd. The small recalibrations, the glances held 1 second longer than casual. She had walked through it both times with her chin level, and her pace even, and she had gone back into the kitchen and kept working. The kitchen had become a kind of refuge and a kind of engine simultaneously, the one place where she was entirely in command of what was happening, where every element had been planned and prepared, and was proceeding according to her understanding of it. Out there, beyond the door, were the 50 people of the county, who had made their opinions of her known through word and silence, and the particular language of a small community. In here there was work, and she knew how to do work. Sheriff Dale Pruitt arrived at 1:45 with his wife, a quiet woman who seemed to have made a separate peace with the kind of man she had married, and 2 other couples whose names Elara had been told by Walt and retained without apparent effort. She heard Pruitt's voice in the yard, that specific carrying quality, the voice of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, and she heard Bram's voice in response, lower, shorter, and then the sound of the group moving toward the tables. Bram came to the kitchen door 5 minutes after that. "Pruitt's here," he said unnecessarily. "I know," she said. "I heard him." He looked at her. "You all right?" "I'm working," she said. "Yes." He stood in the doorway for a moment, too large for it, in the way he was too large for most things, and she could tell from the set of him that he wanted to say something that he wasn't sure how to say. She had learned to read this in him. He communicated better in action than in speech, and when speech was required, he often ran up against some internal wall that took him longer than other people to find his way over. "If he says anything," Bram started. "Then I'll handle it," she said. She looked up at him. "Bram, I've been handling it since I was 9 years old. Go be with your guests." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went. The food went out in stages, the way she had planned it: first the cold dishes, the preserved things, and the pickled vegetables and the bread. Then the hot dishes in sequence, the timing calibrated so that nothing sat too long and nothing arrived too early. She had practiced the sequence in her head so many times that the execution felt almost mechanical, each step following the last with the logic of something inevitable. She was bringing out the third course, a slow-cooked venison with a sauce she had spent 2 days getting right, when she heard it. It came from one of the tables near the fire pit, a woman's voice carrying in the cold air with the cheerful carelessness of someone who had had a glass of something warming and forgotten to calculate distance. The voice belonged to Miriam Kessel, wife of the largest landowner in the county, a woman who had nodded at Elara earlier with the specific courtesy of someone who is being deliberately fair despite their private feelings. What Miriam Kessel said to the woman sitting beside her, in the carrying voice, was, "I'll give her this. The food's better than I expected. I just don't understand what Bram was thinking. A woman like that. It can't be easy for the children." The woman beside her murmured something Elara couldn't hear. Well, Miriam said, Martha was something. I don't think you can replace that with well. She left the rest of it in the air. Elara set the venison dish on the table. She used both hands. She did not look at Miriam Kessel. She moved to the next table and set down the next dish and did not allow her pace to change or her hands to do anything other than exactly what they were supposed to be doing. She went back to the kitchen. Dora was there. She looked at Elara's face and said nothing. "The bread needs to come out," Elara said. "I'll get it," Dora said. Elara stood at the stove with her back to the room and breathed for 30 seconds. Just 30. She counted them. She thought about the sauce she'd spent 2 days on, about the bread Rose had helped with, about the root cellar she'd reorganized and the accounts she'd corrected, and the 3 months of getting up before 5 o'clock in a kitchen that wasn't built for one person to run alone. Then she stopped breathing deliberately and went back to work. It was Rose who changed things, not in a way Elara had planned or anticipated, in the way that children sometimes do the thing that adults have been trying to do for months, without the apparatus of intention, without understanding the weight of it. The food had been out for an hour, and the gathering had settled into the comfortable middle stage, where people were full enough to be happy and not yet ready to leave. Elara had come out of the kitchen for the 3rd time, and was standing near the edge of the yard, slightly apart from the nearest group, checking that the outdoor dishes were holding temperature. She heard Rose before she saw her. Specifically, she heard Rose's voice, and it took her a full 3 seconds to place it, because the sound was something she had only been told about, never heard directly. Rose was singing. She was standing between 2 women Elara didn't know well, women who had apparently been kind to her. You could tell from the way the child was angled toward them, open rather than guarded. And she was singing a small song, something simple and Western, a few verses about weather and horses and coming home. Her voice was high and clear and slightly unsteady in the way of a child who has not sung in a long time and whose voice has not quite remembered all of itself yet. The conversation near her had gone quiet. Not just the 2 women, but the people at the nearest table, and then the people beyond them. Elara stood where she was and did not move. Bram was across the yard. She saw him the moment she looked. He was standing absolutely still, a cup forgotten in his hand, his face doing something she could not entirely describe and did not try to. The look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. Rose finished the song. There was a moment of silence that was not awkward, but the opposite. The kind of silence that happens after something real. Then one of the women touched Rose's shoulder and said something Elara couldn't hear, and the child ducked her head the way children do when they've been praised and aren't sure how to hold it, and the conversations around her resumed. Elara turned back to the dishes she was checking, and pressed her hand flat against the edge of the nearest table, and held herself there for a moment. She was not going to cry in this yard, in front of 50 people, after everything she had done, to ensure they saw something other than what they expected from her. She was absolutely not going to do that. She breathed. She straightened. She went back to the kitchen. Dora looked at her. Rose sang, Elara said. Dora put down what she was holding. I heard, she said. It carried. Elara nodded. She picked up the next dish to go out and looked at it and set it back down and stood there for a moment longer than was efficient. Then she said it was a good song. Yes, Dora said. It was. The moment with Pruitt came later when she had stopped bracing for it. It was past 3 o'clock, and the gathering had passed its peak, and people were beginning the slow departure that takes longer than the arrival, the lingering at wagons, and the last-minute conversations, and the thank yous. She was carrying a stack of empty dishes from the far table back toward the kitchen when he materialized at her elbow, which was a skill she would have been more impressed by if it had been used differently. Mrs. Colter, he said. She kept walking. Sheriff Pruitt. He fell into step beside her, which required some effort on his part, given that she was moving at her working pace, and he had been sitting down for 3 hours. I'll say this, he said. The food was good. Better than good. She said nothing. I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong about something, he said. with the specific quality of someone who is quite proud, but is calculated that admitting this particular wrong costs less than he'll gain. About the food. She stopped and looked at him. He was several inches shorter than her, which she could tell made him slightly uncomfortable, because he shifted his weight and found something near her shoulder to address, rather than meeting her eyes directly. The food, she said, yes, not about anything else. He had the grace to look mildly uncomfortable, which she supposed was something. Well, he said. Thank you for coming, Sheriff, she said. She went into the kitchen. She set the dishes down and stood at the sink and looked out the window at the yard and thought about what had just happened, about what was said and what was not said, and the gap between them, which was the size of a life. She thought about what it meant that the food was good and that she was still the woman from the stage, and that both things could be true simultaneously in a man's head without him feeling any particular obligation to connect them. She thought about the fact that she had not expected resolution in a day, that she had never expected resolution in a day, that whatever changed here would change slowly and imperfectly and incompletely, and that she had known this when she accepted the terms. Knowing it and feeling it were different, though. That was the thing about knowing. It didn't always help with feeling. Bram found her in the kitchen at 4 o'clock, after the last guest had gone. She was washing dishes, not because it was urgent, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The yard outside was quiet, all the lanterns still burning because nobody had thought to take them down yet, and the kitchen was warm with the residual heat of a full day of cooking. He came in and leaned against the counter beside the sink, close enough that she could see him in her peripheral vision, and for a while neither of them said anything. She washed, he stood. Rose sang, he said. I heard her, Elara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then she hasn't not since before Margaret died. I'd given up thinking she would again. Elara rinsed a pot and set it aside. She thought carefully about what she wanted to say, because this was one of those moments where the wrong thing, or the right thing said wrong, would cost something she was not willing to spend. She chose to, Elara said. That was her. I made it so she didn't feel like she had to keep things quiet in order to be safe. He was silent for a long time. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, it's about not adding weight. She put another pot on the drying rack. She was already carrying enough, you all were. She heard him shift. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, lower. Not quite uncertain, but something adjacent to it. Something that was as close as she suspected Bram Colter got to uncertain. Miriam Kessel said something to you, he said. I didn't hear it, but I saw your face after. She considered denying it. Decided against it because she had learned in the past weeks that the things she and Bram left unaddressed between them had a way of becoming larger than the things they said plainly. She said the food was better than she expected, Elara said, and that she didn't understand what you were thinking, bringing someone like me. She paused, and she mentioned Martha. He said nothing for a moment. Then I'm sorry you didn't say it. I know, I'm sorry it was said. She dried her hands on her apron and stood with her back to the sink and looked at the kitchen, her kitchen. Now, she supposed, in whatever complicated sense that was true. It's going to keep being said, she said. I'm not under any illusions about that. They're not going to change in a day because the food was good. No, he agreed. But it's different now, she said. They saw it. Whatever they think about me, they saw it. She looked at her hands, and they heard Rose sing. He looked at her for a long time. There was something in his face that she had been watching develop over weeks, some movement toward her. Slow and deliberate in the way of a large man who has learned to move carefully because the world has not always been built to accommodate him. She was aware of it in the peripheral way. She was aware of many things, cataloging and deferring. You did something today, he said, that I couldn't have done. You built the ranch, she said. I built the structure, she said. You made it somewhere people wanted to come. He paused. Those are not the same thing. She didn't know what to do with that, so she picked up another dish and started washing it. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the dish, those enormous hands, the ones she had noticed in the wagon on the first day, and held it still for a moment, not pulling her toward him, just stopping her. She stood with the dish half in the water and looked at his hand over hers. Elara, he said. What? You don't have to keep moving, he said. Not right now. She stood still. The kitchen was warm and the yard outside was full of lantern light, and somewhere further in the house she could hear Eli and Rose talking, a child's conversation, the ordinary back and forth of two siblings, and the sound of it was so normal that it felt almost extraordinary. She stood still for a moment. Then she finished washing the dish. But slower after that. She washed everything slower after that. The aftermath of the gathering settled over the ranch like the snow had settled quietly, and changing the texture of things without fanfare. She noticed the differences in increments, the way you notice the days getting shorter in December, not a single moment of change, but a cumulative shift that eventually becomes undeniable. Cody stopped making comments at dinner. She noticed this on the Monday after the gathering, and again on Tuesday, and then stopped tracking it because the absence of a thing eventually becomes the new baseline. Pete, who had always been quietly fair, became slightly less quiet. He began saying good morning when he came in for breakfast, which he had not done before. Small thing. She noted it. Walt told her on the Wednesday after that Gerald Harmon had mentioned the venison at the feed store in Red Hollow, and that 3 people had asked who made it. She received this information the way she received most good news, with tempered acknowledgement, careful not to build too much on any single piece, because she had learned that good news has a way of reversing itself if you lean on it too hard. But she thought about it later. In the quiet way, she thought about things she did not want to examine too directly. She thought about Gerald Harmon mentioning the venison and 3 people asking, and she thought about what that meant in the small ecology of a frontier town, where reputation moved through conversation and accumulated slowly, and could not be manufactured but had to be earned through the specific currency of doing things well in front of people who did not expect it. She was building something. She had known it abstractly when she arrived, had made it her intention when Pruitt laughed at her on the stage platform. But knowing your intention and feeling the thing actually taking shape were different, and the difference was not nothing. Eli was the one who surprised her. It happened on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the gathering. She was in the kitchen doing the last of the day's accounting, and he came in from outside, still in his coat, which meant he had not stopped inside when he came back from his chores the way he usually did. He stood in the kitchen with snow on his shoulders and looked at her in the way he had when she first arrived, that suspended, assessing look, like he was still running some internal calculation that hadn't resolved. Eli, she said, without looking up. Your coat? He took it off and hung it on the hook. He came and sat at the kitchen table, which was what he did when he wanted to talk to her, and wasn't sure how to start. She let him sit. She kept her pencil moving. After a while he said, some of the kids at school said their fathers talked about the gathering. She turned a page. What did they say? They said. He stopped. Recalibrated, they said the food was really good, and that our ranch had a real cook again. She wrote a number in the ledger column. That's good to hear. Another pause. He was picking at a crack in the table edge, which he did when he was working through something. They also said some stuff about you, about how you look. She kept writing. And what did you say? The pause was longer this time. She could feel him on the other side of the table, the specific weight of an 11-year-old boy deciding something. I said that those people hadn't eaten the venison and they should shut up. She looked up. He was looking at the table, not at her, with the self-conscious expression of someone who has done something they think was right, but isn't sure how it will be received. She looked at him for a moment. Good, she said. He looked up. Yeah? That was the right thing to say, she said. She went back to her ledger. Thank you. He sat for a while longer. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave either, and eventually he got up and helped himself to the bread that was cooling on the rack, which he did without asking, because in the past weeks he had stopped asking for things in the kitchen and just moved through it with the ease of someone who knows they belong there. She watched him cut a piece of bread with the focused attention he brought to everything physical, and she thought about the porch railing and the trestle tables and the lanterns, and she thought that whatever Eli Colter was going to be when he grew up, he was going to be someone who knew how to do things. That was not nothing. That was actually quite a lot. The harder thing, the thing she had been managing carefully since the gathering, and would continue to manage, was Bram, not managing him in a calculated sense. She was not a calculating person in her personal life, whatever she might be in a kitchen or a ledger. But she was aware of something shifting in the space between them, some slow gravitational change, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it. She had been here before in a different sense. She had not been here before at all in the most important sense. The men she had been around in her life boarders, employers, the occasional person who had expressed interest and then recalculated, had all carried a particular quality to their attention, something that evaluated before it engaged. She had become very good at reading that quality and responding accordingly, which usually meant creating a professional distance that suited everyone. Bram did not have that quality. His attention to her was something else, more direct, less calculating, with the honest quality of a man who had not developed the habit of obscuring what he was actually looking at. On a Friday night, 3 weeks after the gathering, she came into the parlor to return the second book she'd borrowed from his shelf. She read faster than she'd expected to, given the workload, and he was in his chair with a book of his own and the fire going, and he looked up when she came in and said, what did you think of it? She had expected him to be asleep. She stood in the doorway with the book. It was good, she said. The middle section goes long. Which part? The river crossing. He spends 40 pages on a river crossing. He almost smiled, that full almost smile that she had been watching develop over weeks, and had still not seen complete itself. "Pick another," he said, nodding toward the shelf. She went to the shelf. She looked along the spines, reading titles, and was aware of him watching her from the chair with the easy quality of a man in his own home with nothing to prove. She pulled out a title, considered it, put it back, pulled out another. "That one's good," he said from the chair. She looked at the cover. "Have you read everything on this shelf?" "Most of it," he said, "some of them twice." She turned to look at him. "What do you read twice?" He thought about it. "The ones where something changes the second time, where you see something you didn't see the first time through." She looked at the book in her hand. Then she said, "What changes?" "You do," he said. "You're different when you read it the second time, so you see different things." She held the book and looked at him across the room. The fire was the main light, and it made everything warm and specific, the way firelight does, brought certain things forward and pushed others back. She was aware suddenly and clearly of having been in this room many times, and this being the first time it felt like a room she was standing inside, rather than a room she was passing through. "I'll read this one," she said. "Let me know what you think," he said. She took the book to her room. She lay on her bed with the lamp on, and opened to the first page, and read the first paragraph 3 times without retaining it, because she was thinking about what he'd said. "You're different when you read it the second time, so you see different things," and about whether that was a statement about books or about something else, and about the fact that she was not sure, and about the further fact that her uncertainty about it did not feel alarming the way it once would have. She read the first paragraph a 4th time, and this time it went in, and she read until the lamp oil was low and then turned it out and lay in the dark thinking about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her, and about the ranch and the snow outside and the sound of the house settling, which she knew now in all its specific registers, the pipes and the boards, and the place where the wind found the gap under the west door and made a sound like something breathing. She knew the house. She had not expected, 7 weeks ago on that stage platform, with Pruitt's voice ringing in her ears, to be lying in this house 7 weeks later knowing its sounds by heart. She had not expected a great many things about these 7 weeks, and the accumulation of what she had not expected had begun to constitute something she was beginning to understand as a life. Not the life she had imagined, because she had not imagined this life. She had only imagined leaving the one she had. Not a perfect life, because imperfect was the only kind on offer, and she had always known this. But a life with genuine weight to it, genuine consequence, the kind that mattered because the things in it mattered. A child who had started eating again, a boy who had told his classmates to shut up, a kitchen that smelled like everything she had made in it, a man in the next room who read books twice to see what he had missed. Outside the snow continued. The house held. She closed her eyes, and the darkness behind them was the ordinary darkness of someone who has earned the right to rest, and she slept. December deepened, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm, which was different from the autumn rhythm in specific ways she had learned to anticipate. The cold came in harder after the first week of the month, the kind that made the pipes groan before dawn and put a rime of frost on the inside of the kitchen window that she scraped off each morning with a folded cloth before starting the stove. The ranch hands worked shorter outdoor hours and longer indoor ones, mending equipment and reinforcing structures against weather that the territory delivered without apology. She adapted. She had spent her life adapting to the conditions of whatever kitchen she was in, and a ranch Simbers was simply a larger version of the same problem, more variables, higher stakes, the same fundamental requirement of reading what was needed and providing it before it became urgent. What she had not fully anticipated was how much the winter would compress the household. In autumn, there had been natural distance built into the days people going out to work, the yard as a kind of buffer, the space of a working ranch absorbing the particular frictions of people who were still learning each other. In December, the house held everyone closer. Evenings in the parlor. Meals that lasted longer because there was less urgency to get back outside. The children underfoot in the late afternoons when the light was gone and the outdoor work was done. She did not dislike this. That was the thing she kept noticing. She kept waiting to find that the closeness bothered her, and it didn't. She had lived alone in small rooms for 8 years and had told herself she preferred it, and she was revising that conclusion with the specific discomfort of realizing that what you tell yourself you prefer and what you actually prefer are sometimes different things. It was on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December that she read the book Bram had recommended, finished it, actually, sitting in the parlor while he worked at the desk on the far side of the room, and the fire went through its quiet stages. She closed it and held it for a moment and then said, without particularly planning to, he should have told her earlier. Bram looked up from the desk. Who? The man in the book. He knew for 200 pages. He should have told her while there was still time. He put down his pen. He considered this with the thoroughness he brought to things that he thought deserved thoroughness. He didn't know how, he said. That's the problem, she said. Not knowing how isn't the same as not being able to. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "What would you have him say?" She looked at the fire. "The truth," she said, however badly it came out. "The truth badly said is better than nothing said at all." He was quiet for a while. She heard the fire and the wind outside and somewhere in the house, Rose moving around in her room. The child moved at night sometimes, a habit she had developed after her mother died, and that was slowly, only slowly, becoming less frequent. "Elara," he said. She looked at him. He was turned away from the desk entirely now, facing her, his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely together. He had the looks of someone who had been working up to something for a while and had decided tonight was the night. "I know you're still deciding," he said. She waited. "About this," he said. "About whether it works for you." He looked at his hands. "I know you came here because you needed a different life and I offered one. I know that's not the same as wanting this specifically." He looked up. "I want you to know that I see that, and I'm not going to push you towards something you're not sure about." She looked at him for a long time. The fire moved. Rose's footsteps overhead went quiet. "Bram," she said. "I finished the book." He waited. "I think the ending is wrong," she said. "I think he should have had more time." She paused. "But the part before the ending, the part where they were both just in the same house, building the same thing, I thought that part was true." He looked at her carefully. "Which part specifically?" "The part where she realizes she's stopped waiting for it to go wrong," she said, "and starts just being in it." He held her gaze. Something settled in his face, not relief quite. Closer to the particular stillness of someone who has been holding a weight at arm's length and has been told they can bring it in closer. "Okay," he said, "just that." "Okay," she said. Neither of them said anything else about it that night, but something had been set down between them that had previously been held in the air, and the room felt different after, the way a room feels different after the weather outside has changed. The letter from Margaret Colter's mother arrived on a Friday. She knew it was from Margaret's mother before Bram said so, because she saw his face when Pete brought in the mail, and the particular quality of how he handled the envelope carefully. The way you handle something that you know is going to require something of, you told her everything about where it had come from. He took it to the desk after dinner and read it while she was still in the kitchen, and she gave him the privacy of that and did not go into the parlor until she heard him set the letter down. He was sitting with it on the desk in front of him, not looking at it. Looking at the fire, she sat in her chair. She did not ask. After a while, he said, "She wants to come and see the children. Margaret's mother, she wants to come in January." Elara said nothing. "I wrote to her after the gathering," he said. "I told her Rose had started eating properly, that she'd sung." He paused. "I thought she deserved to know." "That was right," Elara said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then she's going to have opinions about you." Elara looked at the fire. "I expect she will. She was very close to Margaret," he said. It was not a warning quite. More like information he felt she needed to have. "I know," she said. "And I'm not." She stopped, chose her words carefully. "I'm not trying to be what Margaret was. I'm not able to be that, and I wouldn't try. But I can be what I am, and let her see that." He looked at her. "What if that's not enough for her?" "Then it's not enough," she said. "I can't control what she decides. I can only decide how I show up." She paused. "The same as with everyone else." He studied her face for a long moment. "You say that very calmly," he said. "I don't feel calm," she said, "but calm is the right approach." He almost laughed. Not quite, but the closest she had seen him come to it, a shift in the whole architecture of his face. "You're very practical," he said. "I've had to be," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up a pen and wrote back to Margaret's mother, and she sat in her chair and read until the lamp needed trimming, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the evening continued in its ordinary way, which was no longer ordinary at all, but had simply become what evenings were. The trouble, when it came, did not come from where she expected. She had been watching for it from outside, from Pruitt, from Miriam Kessel, from the general direction of Red Hollow and its opinions. She had been watching the horizon for it in the specific way of someone who knows weather is coming and is trying to determine which direction. She had not been watching the inside. It came from Eli. It came on a Wednesday morning in the third week of December, and it came out of nothing she could have predicted. She had asked him to bring wood in before school, a routine request, one he had done a dozen times without incident, and he had come back in with a half load and a face that was doing several things at once, none of them readable at a glance. She was at the stove. She heard him set the wood down harder than necessary. "That's not enough for the day," she said without turning around. "I know," he said. The voice was wrong, too flat, compressed. She turned around. He was standing by the wood box with his coat still on, looking at the wall beside her rather than at her. His jaw had the set of someone holding something in that wanted to come out sideways. Eli, she said, what happened? Nothing. Something happened. He looked at her then, and what she saw in his face was not the sideways anger she was accustomed to navigating, but something rawer, something that had been opened recently and was still bleeding, Tommy Harmon said. He stopped. She waited. He said that you were going to leave, Eli said, after winter. That you came for the money, and that mail-order women always leave when they figure out how hard it is. His voice was doing the cracking thing it did when he was trying to control it and couldn't quite manage. He said his mother said you weren't really, that you were never going to be a real. He stopped again. Kitchen was very quiet. Elara set down the spoon she was holding. She turned from the stove fully and looked at Eli, this 11-year-old boy who had spent 14 months building walls around himself and had started, very slowly and very carefully, taking some of the bricks down. Come here, she said. He came. Not quickly, with the wary deliberateness of a boy who was not sure what was coming and was not going to let himself be surprised by it. She did not hug him. She had learned that Eli did not receive hugs well. They made him stiffen, made him feel managed, and he needed to feel like he was choosing the closeness rather than having it imposed. Instead, she pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down so that she was at his level, and she looked at him directly. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her with the specific expression of a child who has been let down before and has not yet decided whether to believe this. I know that's what people say, she said. And I know you've heard it, and I can't tell you what Tommy Harmon's mother is going to say tomorrow or next week. I can't stop people from having opinions, she paused. But I need you to understand something. I am not here for the money. There is not enough money on this ranch to have made that long stage ride worth it. I promise you that. She saw the corner of his mouth move almost. I'm here because I chose to be here, and I'm still here because I'm still choosing it. She looked at him steadily. Every morning, that's how it works. It's not one choice made once. It's the same choice made every day. He was very still. Your mother didn't stop choosing, she said quietly. She was taken, that's different. Don't confuse those two things. Something shifted in his face. She had not been sure whether to say it, whether it was too close, too direct, but she had decided that this boy, specifically, did better with directness than with careful navigation around the hard thing. She had been watching him for 7 weeks, and she was fairly sure of this. His eyes had gone bright in the way they went when he was refusing to let them do what they wanted to do. He looked at the table. He looked at the wall. He pressed his hand flat on the table surface and took a breath. Okay, he said. His voice was thick but holding. Okay, she said. She stood up. Go get the rest of the wood. You'll be late for school. He went. He came back with a full load, properly stacked, and he left for school without saying anything else. And she stood in the kitchen and looked at the wood box and thought about Tommy Harmon's mother and what she had said and about the reach of it, how a casual opinion stated in a house in Red Hollow had traveled to a schoolyard and found its way into an 11-year-old boy's chest and sat there until it came out sideways in a kitchen. She thought about that reach, about the specific way cruelty propagates, not through intention always, but through carelessness, through the offhand comment, the easily shared assumption, the opinion stated without considering who might be listening. She picked up the spoon and went back to the stove. She told Bram that evening. Not immediately. She waited until after dinner, after the children were settled, after the ordinary business of the household had moved through its stages. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things, without embellishment. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing the internal calculation he did when something made him angry, measuring it, deciding how to carry it. I'll talk to Gerald Harmon, he said. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Why not? Because it makes it larger than it needs to be, she said. Eli handled it. I handled it. Making it into a confrontation gives it weight it doesn't deserve. She paused. And it puts you in the position of defending me publicly, which I'll do, he said. I know, she said, but I'd rather earn it than have it defended. She held his gaze. Does that make sense? He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them made the same underwater light it always did when it needed trimming. She kept meaning to do it and forgetting. It makes sense, he said finally. I don't like it. You don't have to like it, she said. You just have to let me handle my own. It's not just yours, he said. It came out with more force than he usually used, and she stopped. He looked at the table. He said more quietly, when someone says something about you, it's not just about you. It's about this family. It's about what we're building here. He looked up. I need you to understand that. She looked at him. The word family had been said simply, without performance, as a statement of fact rather than intention, and the simplicity of it was what landed. All right, she said. All right, I can talk to Gerald Harmon. Or all right, you understand. All right, I understand, she said. Don't talk to Gerald Harmon. But she paused. Thank you. He nodded. He picked up his book and did not read it, and she picked up her ledger and did not write in it, and they sat across from each other in the lamplit kitchen, and the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who have just said something real and are letting it settle. Christmas at the Colter Ranch was not a celebration Elara had planned for, which meant it was the first thing in months that she approached without a preparation schedule. She found this uncomfortable in a way that surprised her. She was not a sentimental person about holidays, had not been in a position to be most of her adult life, but the approach of Christmas on the ranch carried an emotional weight she had not anticipated. The children felt it. Rose had been both more present and more fragile in the week leading up to it, appearing in the kitchen more often than usual, asking questions about cooking that were only partly about the cooking. Eli had become quieter in a different way than his usual quiet. Not the closed quiet of someone managing anger, but the open quiet of someone sitting with something sad. She understood. The first Christmas after a loss was not one thing. It was every memory of every previous Christmas arriving at once, and the specific absence of the person who was supposed to be there to share them. She could not fill that absence. She did not try. What she did instead was make the kitchen available. She kept it warm, and she kept things in it that smelled good, and she stayed out of the way when the children needed to be sad and stayed present when they needed someone to talk at. She made the food she guessed might have been familiar. Asked Pete once, carefully, what Mrs. Colter had usually made at Christmas, and Pete told her without making too much of being asked, and she made them without announcing she was making them, so they appeared on the table not as a tribute or a replacement, but simply as food. On Christmas morning, Rose came downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "It smells like last year." Elara was at the stove. "Good," she said. Rose was quiet for a moment. Then yes. She came into the kitchen and climbed onto her stool. "Are you going to make the sweet rolls already rising?" Elara said. Rose sat on her stool and watched the kitchen work in the particular way she had developed over weeks. The way of a child who has found that watching is a form of participation that doesn't require anything of her she isn't ready to give. But she was closer than she used to sit. The stool had migrated, over weeks, from near the window to near the bread station, and she had not moved it back. Eli came down later and ate his breakfast with both elbows on the table, which she allowed because it was Christmas and because some rules are for ordinary days. He did not talk much, but he was present in the right way, and when Bram came in from the morning chores and looked around the kitchen, at Rose on her stool, at Eli with his elbows on the table, at the sweet rolls just coming out of the oven, his face did the thing it sometimes did, that movement towards something he didn't have a word for. He looked at Elara. She handed him a cup of coffee. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said. It was simple. It was not a perfect Christmas. Rose cried once in the afternoon, briefly, and went upstairs and came back down red-eyed and clearly not wanting to discuss it, and nobody discussed it. Eli broke a dish washing up and was disproportionately upset about it in the way that meant the dish wasn't really what he was upset about, and she told him it was an old dish and handed him another to dry. Bram was quieter than usual in the afternoon, and she gave him the space of that. None of it was smooth, all of it was real. She found she preferred that and was not entirely surprised to find it. Martin Kessel came to the ranch on a Thursday morning in the last week of December. She did not know who he was when Pete came to the kitchen and said there was someone at the door asking for Bram. But something in the way Pete said it careful, weighing made her pay attention. She was in the kitchen when she heard the voices in the parlor, and she stayed in the kitchen and worked and listened to the quality of the conversation without being able to make out the words. And after 15 minutes, Bram came to the kitchen doorway with a face that had been arranged into something neutral in the deliberate way that meant the neutral was effortful. "Martin Kessel wants to talk to you," he said. She set down her work. "He wants to apologize," Bram said. He paused. For what Miriam said at the gathering, she looked at him. "He's come to apologize for his wife? He says it's from both of them." She considered this for a moment, turning it over. Martin Kessel was the largest landowner in the county, a man whose opinion functioned less as a personal view and more as a weather system. It created conditions that other people then navigated. If Martin Kessel came to her door to apologize, it would be known. It would change something in the ecology of Red Hollow in ways she could not entirely predict. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the parlor. Martin Kessel was a large man, not in Bram's register, but large, in the manner of successful men in middle-aged, solid, well-fed, carrying his authority in his posture the way some men carry it in their voice. He was standing when she came in, which she noted. He had a hat in his hands, which he was turning slowly, which she also noted. "Mrs. Colter," he said. "Mr. Kessel," she said. She did not tell him to sit. She waited. He looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now deciding how much of the rehearsal to use. He started, and then seemed to decide against the rehearsed version. what Miriam said at the gathering. It wasn't right. She looked at him steadily. No, she said, it wasn't. He blinked. She suspected he had expected something more accommodating, a denial that she'd heard, perhaps, or the gracious deflection of a woman who understood that accepting an apology required pretending the offense was smaller than it was. I should have said something to her at the time, he said. I didn't, that's on me. Yes, she said, another blink. The what you put together for the gathering. It was the best dinner the county's seen in years, maybe longer. He paused. Miriam said so herself later. She's too proud to come and say it, but she said it. Elara considered him for a moment. She thought about Miriam Kessel's voice carrying in the cold yard air, the words and the casualness of them, the ease with which they were said about a person standing 20 feet away. She thought about the 30 seconds she had spent at the stove afterward, pressing herself into stillness. She thought about what this man coming to her door cost him in terms of his own pride, and what it meant in terms of the county's social arithmetic. And she thought about what the right response was. Not the gracious response, not the response that made him most comfortable, but the honest one. Thank you for coming, she said. I appreciate it. He nodded, clearly uncertain whether that was acceptance or something else. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, she said. Running this ranch, cooking for this family. Whatever people think about it. She met his eyes. But it matters that you came. It's better when people say things plainly. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, a reassessment happening. In real time, she could see it. You're direct, he said. I found it saves time, she said. It was the same thing she had said to Bram in their first weeks, and it was still true. Kessel almost smiled. Fair enough, he said. He put his hat back on. Bram's lucky, he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded and added, The ranch is lucky. We're all working at it, she said. He left. She stood in the parlor doorway and heard the wagon pull away, and then went back to the kitchen. Bram was there. He had apparently retreated to the kitchen during the conversation, which she suspected was intentional, giving her the parlor, removing himself from the equation. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and his face doing the complicated thing it did when he was trying not to express something too directly. Well, he said. He apologized, she said. I know. I could hear. He paused. How was it? She thought about it. Real enough, she said. He didn't have to come. That matters. Does, he said. Kessel doesn't do things he doesn't mean to do. She picked up her apron strings and retied them, more for something to do with her hands than because they needed retying. He said, The ranch is lucky, she said. Bram looked at her. He's not wrong. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the straightforward directness he had always had. No hedging, no looking away. She had learned over these weeks that this was one of the most reliable things about him. He was not a man who looked away from things he felt. Bram, she said. What? She considered what she wanted to say. There were many options, and she went through them quickly, and found that most of them were too large or too small for the moment. She settled on the one that was simply true. I think I was ready for this to be my life before I let myself admit it, she said. It took me a while to catch up. He held very still. Catch up to what? To already being here, she said. To already. She stopped, started again. I kept waiting to feel like a visitor. And somewhere I stopped feeling like a visitor, and I didn't notice exactly when. He uncrossed his arms. He straightened from the counter. He crossed the kitchen toward her in the deliberate way of a large man who had decided to move and was moving, and he stopped close enough that she had to look up, which she had gotten used to, that particular angle, the one that almost no one required of her. Lara, he said. What? I'm going to say something badly, he said. I told you I don't say things well, I know, she said. Say it anyway. He looked at her face. She watched him find it, whatever it was, watched the thing he had been carrying move from wherever he kept it to somewhere closer to the surface. From the first week, he said. When you told me about Rose about not adding weight, I knew then that he stopped. I knew you were... He stopped again. He let out a breath. I knew you were the right person, he said. I just didn't know yet how many ways that was true. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, and the snow outside was the particular blue-white of late December afternoon. And somewhere in the house Rose was humming. Not a song, exactly. Just the sound a child makes when she is content and not thinking about it. That wasn't bad, she said. The ending was bad, he said. The ending was fine, she said. He put his hand against her face, just his palm, just for a moment, and she let it rest there and felt the specific warmth of it. That enormous hand, careful in the way she had watched it be careful from the first day. Then he took it away and stepped back, which was right, which was the right pace. I'll get the wood in, he said. Thank you, she said. He went out. She stood in the kitchen and heard the back door, heard his boots on the porch boards, heard the specific sound of the yard in winter when there is one person moving through it and the snow absorbs everything else. She stood and breathed and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and whether she was ready for what it meant. She thought, yes. Imperfectly, incompletely, with full knowledge of the gaps and the uncertainties and the work still ahead, yes. The letter she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it, came on a Tuesday in the last days of December. It was from a woman named Elara Voss, her father's sister, the only relative she had maintained any contact with, through brief notes at long intervals, the kind of correspondence that is kept alive more through habit than warmth. The letter had been redirected twice, first to Cincinnati and then to Cheyenne and then finally to Red Hollow, and it arrived creased and slightly water-damaged along one corner and was dated October, which meant it had been traveling for 3 months. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon while the house was quiet. Her aunt wrote that her father had died in September, that it had been sudden, that she thought Elara would want to know, though she understood they had not been close. She sat with the letter for a while. She thought about her father, not the distant, remarried man of her adult life, but the earlier version, the one from before her mother died, who had once taken her to the county fair and let her eat 3 pieces of pie and not said a word about it. She thought about that version and its disappearance, and about the fact that she had spent years hoping for some version of it to return and had eventually stopped hoping, and about the particular weight of a grief that has already been done for years before the death happens. She was not going to fall apart over this. That was not what she felt. What she felt was something older and more complicated, something that had been sitting in her since childhood, and that the letter had simply named. She was still sitting there when Bram came in from outside. He looked at her face, and then at the letter on the table, and came and sat across from her without being asked. "Someone died," he said. "It was not a question. My father," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Were you close?" "No," she said. "Not for a long time." She looked at the letter. "That's the hard part, I think. The not having been close." She paused. "It's easier when you've had it and lost it. When you never had it," she stopped. "You grieve the thing that didn't happen," he said. She looked at him. Yes, he nodded slowly. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Somewhere in the house, Rose was humming again. She had been doing it more often now, that unconscious humming, and it had become one of the sounds of the ranch that Elara had filed into the category of things she did not want to lose. She looked at Bram's hand over hers. She looked at the letter. She looked at the kitchen around her, the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the cracked bread oven she had learned to work with, the stool near the bread station, the hooks where 3 different sizes of coats now hung, including a small one that had been too big in October and was now only slightly too big. She looked at all of it and thought about her father dying in September in Cincinnati, while she was in Wyoming learning to rotate bread at 15 minutes. And she thought about the strange arithmetic of a life, what you lose and what you build, and whether the building is a response to the losing or something that would have happened anyway, and whether it matters. She thought it probably didn't matter. The building was what it was regardless of the reason. "Bram," she said. "Yeah, I'm glad I came," she said. Not as a response to his kindness, not as a statement about her father's death. Just as a fact, stated plainly, the truth badly said being better than nothing said at all. He pressed her hand once briefly. "So am I," he said. Outside, the December wind came off the mountains and crossed the Colter ranch and found the house solid and did not find its way in. And inside the kitchen, the stove burned steadily, and the bread for tomorrow was already rising. And the woman at the table sat with the man across from her and held her own grief and her own gladness simultaneously, which is the only way either of them can honestly be held. The new year came in quietly. There was no celebration at the Colter ranch, no staying up until midnight, no particular ceremony to mark the turning. Elara was asleep by 10 o'clock on the last night of December, which was the earliest she had gone to bed in weeks, and she woke on the first morning of January to the same frost on the inside of the kitchen window, the same dark before 5, the same stove that needed starting. The year changed and the work did not, which she found she preferred. Ceremony had never done much for her. What she trusted was the ordinary day, the work that came with it, the accumulation of ordinary days into something that eventually became a life. She made coffee and scraped the window and started the oats, and stood in the kitchen in the early dark and thought about the year behind her, and the year ahead, not in a sentimental way, but in the practical way of someone taking stock before proceeding. She was not the same person who had stood on that stage platform in Red Hollow with her suitcase in both hands and Pruitt's laughter in the air. That was not a poetic observation, it was simply accurate. She had come here with the specific compacted self of a person who has spent years making herself small enough not to be a problem. And somewhere in the past 3 months that compaction had begun to loosen, slowly and not without discomfort, the way a joint loosens after long cold stiffly, with some pain, but toward something better than what it had been. She heard Bram on the porch at 5:15, the familiar weight of his footfall, and she had his coffee ready when he came in, which was not a concession or a domestic performance, but simply a thing that made the morning work better, and she had stopped analyzing the difference. He came in with cold air in the fabric of his coat and took the cup and said, "Happy New Year." "Happy New Year," she said. That was it. They were both people who understood that some things didn't need to be larger than they were, and a new year was simply a new year. The same mountains, the same cold, the same ranch, with its work and its particular people. They stood in the warm kitchen and drank their coffee, and the year began the same way. Every worthwhile thing she had ever built had begun, without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary morning. Margaret Colter's mother arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of January. Her name was Louise Carey, and she came on the stage from Cheyenne with a single trunk and the posture of a woman who had spent 60 years being the most organized person in whatever room she entered. She was small and sharp-eyed and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned not to waste effort. Pete brought her from Red Hollow in the wagon, and Elara heard the wagon in the yard and stood in the kitchen and breathed once, slowly, and then went to the front door. Louise Carey stepped down from the wagon and looked at the house and then at Elara, and her face did the same thing most faces did, the quick calculation, the adjustment. She was better at concealing it than most people, but Elara had spent 26 years watching for it, and she did not miss it. "Mrs. Carey," she said, "I'm Elara Colter. Welcome." Louise Carey looked at her for a moment longer than a casual greeting required. Then she said, "Thank you for having me," in the voice of a woman who had decided to be fair before she had decided anything else. And that quality of prior decision, the deliberate fairness, was something Elara understood and respected, even if it was also, in its way, a form of distance. Bram came from the barn. He greeted Louise with the slightly formal warmth of a man who had loved this woman's daughter and no longer knew exactly where that placed them in relation to each other, bound, still, but differently, and the manner of the binding had not yet been renegotiated. Louise touched his arm when she saw him briefly, the gesture of a woman who does not touch people easily but means it completely when she does. The children were inside. Rose had been told her grandmother was coming and had responded with a complicated quiet that Elara had not tried to interpret or manage, had simply let it be what it was. Eli had gone more still than usual, which meant he was thinking about something he didn't know how to say. Elara brought Louise inside and showed her to the guest room and left her to settle, and she went back to the kitchen and resumed the work she had been doing, which was the preparation for dinner. She heard, after a while, the sound of a door and footsteps in the hall, and then a child's voice, Rose's voice, high and slightly uncertain, saying, "Grandma." And then Louise Carey's voice, lower, cracking slightly at one edge in the way that voices crack when they are trying to hold more than they can comfortably hold. "Oh, sweet girl, let me look at you." Elara kept her hands in the bread dough and looked at the kitchen wall and gave that moment the privacy it deserved. The first 2 days with Louise were careful days. That was the only word for them. Everyone in the house was being careful with Louise. Careful around the subject of Margaret. Careful with each other in the particular way of people who are sharing a space with someone new, whose rules are not yet fully understood. Elara had been the new person in this house not long ago, and she remembered the texture of it from the other side. Louise watched everything. She did it with more discretion than most people. She was not obvious about it, did not follow Elara around or ask pointed questions, but she watched, and Elara felt the watching and did not let it change what she did or how she did it. She cooked what she cooked. She managed the household the way she managed it. She spoke to the children the way she spoke to them. On the second evening, she came into the parlor to find Louise sitting with Rose, the child pressed against the older woman's side, in the way she pressed against people she trusted, and Louise was showing her something, a small piece of embroidery it looked like, held between them. They did not notice Elara in the doorway, or if Louise did, she gave no sign. Elara watched for just a moment, the specific quality of the child's attention, the way she was leaning in rather than maintaining distance. And then she stepped back and went down the hall and left them to it. She thought about what it meant to share a child. Not in a legal or territorial sense, but in the older, more complicated sense, the sense that a child belongs to the people who love her, and love does not divide but multiplies. And the space in a child's heart for people who are good to her is not a fixed quantity. She thought about Rose leaning against Louise with the same easy trust she now showed in the kitchen with Elara, and she thought that this was exactly right, and that anyone who would have felt threatened by it was not thinking about the child, but about themselves. She was thinking about the child. That realization arrived quietly, without drama. It was simply true. The conversation with Louise happened on the third day. It was not a conversation Elara had sought, but she had known it was coming in the way you know when weather is coming. Not the exact hour, but the certainty of it. Louise came to the kitchen on Thursday morning while Eli was at school, and Rose was playing in the yard with the dog Pete had inexplicably adopted in November, and Bram was out on the east pasture, and it was just the two of them in the kitchen, with the sound of the fire and the particular winter quiet. Louise sat at the kitchen table. She did not ask permission. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Elara at the stove, with the expression of someone who has been working up to something and has decided to stop working up and simply do it. She kept the kitchen cleaner, Louise said. Elara turned from the stove and looked at her. Margaret, Louise said. She was meticulous, about the kitchen especially. She looked at the surfaces, which were clean, organized in Elara's particular logic. Not messy, but not what this woman had known. It's different. Yes, Elara said. I expect it is. Louise looked at her directly. I'm not saying that to... She stopped. Started again. I'm telling you because I think you deserve honesty. And because I've been sitting here 3 days watching you, and I owe you some. Elara put down what she was holding and came and sat across from Louise at the kitchen table, which felt like the right response, not defensive, not accommodating, but present. All right, she said, then be honest. Louise looked at her hands. I was angry when Bram wrote. About you, about the advertisement, the whole thing. She said it without apology, which Elara respected. Margaret had only been gone 14 months. It felt fast. It felt like he was... She stopped. Replacing her, Elara said.
Yes.
He wasn't, Elara said. Louise looked up. I know that now, she said. I know it because I've been here 3 days and I can see. She paused. And in the pause, Elara could see her working something through, revising something she had held firmly for months. I can see what's happened to this house. What's happened to Rose? Her voice changed slightly on Rose's name. She sang at the gathering. Bram wrote to me about it. I didn't believe it until I heard her in the yard yesterday. Elara said nothing. She hadn't, not since before Margaret was sick, Louise said. Even before she died. When Margaret was sick, Rose stopped. We all thought she was, that she might not come back from it. That kind of silence in a child is... She pressed her lips together briefly. It's frightening. I know, Elara said. Louise looked at her. How did you do it? Elara thought about how to answer this honestly. She thought about the stool migrating from the window to the bread station. She thought about the cinnamon jar. She thought about saying not much and allowing the silence to be what it was. I didn't do much, she said. That's the honest answer. I didn't require anything of her. I stayed near enough that she knew I was there and far enough that she didn't feel pressed. She paused. I know what it's like to need that from someone. I know what it's like when you don't get it. Louise looked at her for a long moment. That's more than it sounds like, she said. Maybe, Elara said. Louise was quiet for a while. She looked at the kitchen. A long, considered look. The kind that was taking things in rather than simply observing them. Then she said the bread. She's been helping with the bread. Since before the gathering, Elara said. The egg wash was her first job. Something moved in Louise's face, complicated, not simple. The expression of a woman holding grief and gratitude simultaneously, which is a difficult thing to hold and shows on the face of someone who is not practiced at hiding their real feelings under their careful ones. Margaret taught her that, she said. The egg wash. She used to let Rose do it when Rose was very small. She'd sit on a chair. I didn't know that, Elara said. I asked her because she mentioned smelling cinnamon. She paused. It was just the natural next step. Louise nodded slowly. She nodded for a while, looking at the table. Then she said, I came here thinking I didn't know what I would find. I thought I might find my grandchildren being managed by someone who was here for reasons that had nothing to do with them. She looked up. I was wrong about that. You were reasonable to worry about it, Elara said. Perhaps, Louise said. But I was still wrong. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. Do you love them? She said it directly without cushioning it. The children. Not, I know. This is still new. But is it? She was usually precise with words. Elara had noticed, and the imprecision told her how much the question cost. Elara did not answer immediately. She thought about Eli in the schoolyard defending her. She thought about Rose on her stool with the egg wash brush held so carefully. She thought about the way both of them existed in the house now with a comfort that had not been there in October, a naturalness, a willingness to simply be in the same rooms without the guarded quality of children who are not sure the adults around them can be trusted. She thought about love and what the word actually meant when you applied it to specific people in specific circumstances, not the large declared version of the word, not the version in novels, but the version that shows up in practice, the version that is made of attention and consistency and showing up the same way day after day until the showing up becomes the thing itself. Yes, she said. Not the way they had it before, not trying to be that, but yes. Louise held her gaze for a long time. Then she nodded once with the finality of someone who has been conducting an internal proceeding and has reached a verdict. Good, she said. She stood up from the table. I'd like to learn your bread rotation, she said. The oven crack. Bram mentioned it in his letter. I always wondered why the bread came out wrong sometimes. Elara looked at her for a moment, then she stood up and went to the stove. 15 minutes, she said. And you have to rotate toward the left, away from the crack, not toward it. The heat pulls differently. Show me, Louise said. She showed her. Louise stayed 10 days in the end, which was 4 days longer than she had planned. On her last evening, she sat with Rose at the kitchen table for an hour, and they did the embroidery together. And Eli came in from outside, and sat down and watched them without saying anything, which was his version of wanting to be included, without admitting he wanted to be included. Elara made tea and brought it to the table, and Rose looked up and said, "Can you sit with us?" She sat with them. It was not a significant moment. It was simply a Tuesday evening in January at a kitchen table in Wyoming. 4 people drinking tea and doing embroidery. 1 person doing embroidery, 1 person watching, 1 person pretending to read a book he had already finished, 1 person who had spent 26 years being too large for the rooms she was in, sitting at a kitchen table that held her exactly right. Not significant, just true. Louise left on a Wednesday morning, and before she got on the wagon, she took Elara's hands in both of hers, a gesture that did not come easily to her. Elara could tell, and which she received accordingly, knowing the cost. "Write to me," Louise said. "About the children, about Rose especially." She paused. "About yourself." "I will," Elara said. Louise looked at her with the clear eyes of a woman who has revised a significant opinion, and is at peace with the revision. "Margaret, what if she stopped?" She shook her head slightly. "I don't know what she would have thought. I'm not going to pretend I do. But I know what I think." "What do you think?" Elara said. "I think my grandchildren are being loved," Louise said. "And I think the ranch is being held up by someone who knows how to hold things." She released Elara's hands. "That's what I think." She got on the wagon. Pete drove her to Red Hollow. The wagon went through the gate and down the road, and Elara stood in the yard and watched it until it was gone. And then she stood there a little longer, because sometimes a moment needed to be stood in for its full duration before you went back to the work. February came in with a storm that lasted 4 days. Not a blizzard. The territory saved blizzards for moments when it felt like making a point, but a steady snow that layered itself over the ranch with the quiet authority of weather that does not need to prove anything. The yard disappeared. The fence posts became suggestions. The outdoor work contracted to the essential, which was the animals, and Bram and Cody and Pete and Walt did that in shifts, coming in with the cold deep in their coats, thawing at the stove, going back out. Elara managed the inside of the storm the way she had managed everything, by understanding what was needed and providing it before it became a crisis. She kept the kitchen at a temperature that made the stove the center of the house's social life. She made food that warmed rather than simply fed. She kept track of the outdoor shifts and had something ready when each person came in, which was not elaborate but was consistently timed, and timing, she had learned, was as important as the food itself. There is a difference between warmth that waits for you and warmth that you have to wait for. On the second night of the storm, she woke to a sound she could not immediately place. Not the house, not the wind, not any of the sounds she had cataloged in the months of living here. She lay still and listened, and then got up and put on her robe and went into the hall. Rose was standing outside her own door, not crying, just standing in the dark in her nightgown with her arms wrapped around herself, very still. Elara came and crouched in front of her, which was an awkward posture but put her at the child's level. "Bad dream?" she said. Rose shook her head, then nodded, then shook her head again. "Hard to know which," Elara said. Rose looked at her. In the dark, with just the light from the end of the hall where someone had left a lamp low, her face was very young and very tired. "I dreamed about Mama," she said. Elara sat down on the hallway floor. Not gracefully. There was no graceful version of sitting on a floor in a narrow hallway in the middle of the night. But she sat down and she opened her arms slightly, and Rose came and sat beside her and leaned against her. She did not say anything about the dream. She did not say that the dream was just a dream, or that her mother was at peace, or any of the things that adults say to children about grief because the silence of not saying them is uncomfortable. She sat on the floor and let Rose lean, and felt the child's weight against her side, and let the hallway be what it was, cold and dark, and also somehow adequate. A place where someone had come, and someone had sat with them. After a while, Rose said, "Do you dream about people who are gone?" "Yes," Elara said. "Is it sad?" She thought about this honestly. Sometimes. Sometimes it's just like a visit. You get to see them again. She paused. "Even if you wake up and they're not there." Rose thought about this. "I don't mind the sad part," she said. "I just don't like waking up." "No," Elara said. "That part's hard." They sat for a while longer. Then Rose said, "Can I sleep in your room?" "Yes," Elara said. They went to her room and she made a space and the child climbed in, and was asleep in 4 minutes, with the immediate certainty of a child who has been given what she needed and can now let go. Elara lay beside her in the dark and listened to the storm outside and the small sounds of Rose sleeping, and thought about the hallway and the floor and the question, "Do you dream about people who are gone?" And she thought about her mother and her father and the aunt's letter, and all the people who had been in her life briefly or badly, and had left something behind in the leaving. She thought about the specific truth she had tried to give the child, that even sad things can be visits, that the missing is not only loss but also proof of what was real. She was 37 years old when she understood this completely. Lying on a winter night in a room in Wyoming with someone else's child breathing steadily beside her, she understood it not as a consolation but as a fact simply true, the way the crack in the oven wall was simply true, something to know and work with rather than resist. She slept. March arrived like a promise that wasn't quite ready to be kept warmer some days. Then cold again, the snow retreating and then returning, the territory negotiating with spring in its unhurried way. The days got longer by increments that were felt before they were measured, the light at 5 o'clock becoming something other than dark, and the ranch responded the way ranches respond to the turn of the year. More to do, longer days. The particular energy of things that have been held in suspension, beginning to move again. Cody handed in his notice on a Thursday in March. He came to the kitchen to tell her, which she had not expected. She had expected him to tell Bram, and for Bram to tell her, which would have been the easier route and the one that required less from him. Instead, he came to the kitchen door in the morning with his hat in his hands, the same posture Martin Kessel had used in the parlor in December, which she noted without knowing what to do with it. And he said he was moving on, that there was work further north, that he appreciated. He stopped here and seemed to find the right word, the fair treatment. She looked at him. He was 23, 24. Not a bad person, she had concluded somewhere in the middle of January. A young person who had needed to be important in the room and had felt that importance threatened by her presence, and had not had the tools at the time to manage that with more grace than he'd shown. Those were correctable things in a person who had time and the inclination. "Good luck," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He started to go, then stopped. "The gathering," he said without turning around. I heard people talking about it for weeks." In Red Hollow. She waited. He turned partway. "I was wrong," he said. "About you being able to do it." He stopped. "I was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. "You did good work on the tables," she said. And the tablecloths, the corner of his mouth moved. "I hope the North works out." He left. She watched him go through the yard and thought about the specific cost of admitting you were wrong to someone you had been wrong about. How much more it costs than the original wrongness, and how much more it is worth. And she thought that Cody Walker would probably be a better man for having done it, even if he would not entirely understand why for a while yet. Spring came properly in April, and with it the kind of work that reorganized everything else around it. The spring work was the hardest Elara had experienced on the ranch, not because she was unprepared for it, but because its scale was simply larger than anything the closed-in winter months had required. Calving, planting, fence repair across the whole of the east pasture, which Eli participated in after school with the focused energy of a boy who had found that physical work was an excellent container for everything he was feeling at any given time. Kitchen shifted to accommodate the rhythms of it, earlier breakfasts, larger quantities, the particular meal planning of a cook who understands that people doing heavy outdoor work in cold air need food that functions more like fuel than like comfort. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, at the logistical problem of feeding people well under constraint, and she found in the spring work a kind of satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of the gathering, or the satisfaction of the evenings in the parlor, more immediate, less complicated, the clean pleasure of a thing done right and needed. It was during calving week, the 3rd week of April, when the whole ranch was operating on disrupted sleep and compressed time, that she understood something she had been approaching for months. She was in the barn at 2 a.m. because one of the cows was having trouble, and Pete had come to get her, not because she was expected to know about cattle, but because he thought an extra pair of steady hands was better than no extra pair, and he was right. She held the lantern and watched and handed Pete what he needed, and did not flinch from what was difficult, which was considerable. And when it was over and the calf was on its feet and the cow had settled, she stood in the barn in the cold with straw on her boots and lantern light, making shadows of the stalls, and she thought, "I know this place. Not just the kitchen, not just the house, the whole of it, the east pasture, and the cracked bread oven, and the lamp that always needed trimming, and the sound of the pipe in the northwest corner of the house that groaned before the temperature dropped, and the way Rose's voice carried in the yard when she was happy, and the specific weight of Eli's footstep on the porch when he was tired versus when he was troubled. She knew it the way you know a person you have lived alongside for long enough. Not completely, not without gaps, but in the genuine, useful, irreplaceable way of real familiarity. She walked back to the house in the dark with the lantern in her hand, and the cold air was the cold air of the Colter ranch in April, which was specific and familiar, and the house at the end of the yard was lit in the kitchen window because Bram was up and had left a light on, and she went inside and he was at the table with coffee, and he looked at her when she came in and said, "How is she?" "Calf's up," she said. "Good." He poured her a cup. She sat down and pulled off her boots and put her hands around the cup, and the kitchen was warm in the way it was always warm because she kept the stove right. And she was tired, in the particular way of 2 in the morning after difficult work, and she was without any ceremony or announcement, entirely at home. She thought about the woman on the stage platform in September. She thought about the suitcase held in both hands, and Pruitt's voice, and the laughter of people who had decided, in the time it took to look, that she would not last. She thought about what those people were made of, their certainty, their casual cruelty, the ease with which they had arranged her into the shape of someone who did not belong. And she thought about what she was made of, which was something they had not troubled themselves to look for. People see what they expect to see. That is not a complicated truth, but it is an important one, and it costs something to learn it properly. To learn it not as a piece of advice or a consolation, but in the specific, lived, expensive way of having been on the receiving end of it for long enough to understand it from the inside. What Elara Voss had learned, across 26 years and one Wyoming winter, was that the people who decided quickly about her were not seeing her. They were seeing the shape of a thing they had decided about before she arrived. And you cannot argue with that kind of blindness. You cannot perform your way out of it or shrink yourself into something it can accommodate. The only thing you can do is continue to be what you are, in front of it, until either it adjusts or it becomes irrelevant. Both had happened here. Both were still happening. That was the other thing she had learned. It doesn't finish. There is no day when the last person revises their opinion and the work of being seen accurately is complete. There are only the ordinary days in which you continue and in which the continuing is itself the answer to every version of the question that had ever been asked about whether you could. Bram asked her on a May evening, not dramatically, not on a knee, not with a rehearsed speech. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, a thing they had started doing in April when the evenings got warm enough, the two of them in the 2 chairs that Pete had dragged out one afternoon without being asked. And the light was the long golden light of a May evening, the kind that makes everything look the way it actually is, rather than the way you usually see it. He said, "I want to do this right." She was looking at the yard, at the lanterns Eli had restrung in better positions last week. "Do what right this?" He made a slight gesture that encompassed the porch and the yard, and she understood, something larger than either. I'd like us to be married, properly, not just the arrangement we came in on." He looked at her. "I want to choose it, and I want you to choose it. Not because it made sense in September, but because it makes sense now, with full understanding of what it is." She looked at the yard for a moment. She thought about the word he had used, arrangement, and about the thing it was accurate about, and the thing it had stopped being accurate about somewhere in the middle of October, which was that the arrangement had become something that the word arrangement was no longer large enough for. She thought about what full understanding meant. She had full understanding of the crack in the oven, and the pipe that groaned before weather, and the children, and this man beside her, who was not simple, who was stubborn in specific ways, and not communicative enough, and who had a tendency to carry things alone, past the point where sharing them would have been better, and who was also steady and honest, and who had put himself between her and Pruitt on her first day without being asked, and who read books twice to see what he had missed. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "That's all? What else would you like?" He almost smiled. And this time it finished. The smile she had been watching approach for months arrived completely, and it changed his face in the way that a full expression changes a face that has been partial for a long time. "Nothing," he said. "That's exactly enough." They sat on the porch in the May evening. Across the yard, through the kitchen window, she could see the lamp they always left burning, the one she had taken over trimming because she passed it most often, and the kitchen beyond it that smelled of dinner and bread, and the specific combination of things that had been cooked in it over a winter, accumulated in the walls, and the wood the way all domestic histories accumulate, invisible and permanent. The wedding was in June. Small. She had not wanted large, and Bram had not wanted large, and so it was small. Walt and Dora. Pete, the Kessel family. Louise Carey, who came back from Cheyenne on the stage and embraced Elara at the door of the house, with the warmth of a woman who had stopped being careful. Eli stood beside his father and was serious in the particular way. He was serious about things that mattered to him. Rose stood beside Elara in a dress that had been let out at the hem for the 3rd time, and at some point during it she took Elara's hand and held it. and Elara held it back. There was food, of course. She had made most of it herself with Dora, and Rose had done the egg wash on the bread, and Eli had helped with the tables in the yard. Even Walt, who was not much use in a kitchen, had peeled something. Sheriff Pruitt did not come. She had not invited him. She did not think about this as a victory or as an act of exclusion. She thought of it as accurate. Some people are not part of your story in the end, regardless of the role they played in its beginning. Martin Kessel stood at the table near the end of the afternoon and said, "To no one in particular, Bram Colter did all right." And Frances Harmon said, "Better than all right." And Elara, who was close enough to hear it, did not turn around but allowed herself privately to count it. That evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, and the yard was quiet with the long summer dusk of Wyoming in June, Bram found her in the kitchen. She was not cleaning. She was standing at the window with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink, looking at the yard, at the table still out, the lanterns Eli had strung, the specific quality of the light going gold over the ranch. He came and stood beside her. They stood together at the window the way they had stood together in the kitchen many times, in the various lights of the various seasons, looking at the same thing from beside each other. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered the question. She thought about September and the stage and the suitcase. She thought about October and the cracked oven and the sideways anger of a boy with nowhere to put it and a girl who had stopped eating and stopped singing. She thought about December and the gathering and Miriam Kessel's voice in the cold air and Louise's hands on hers at the door. She thought about the storm in February and a child in a hallway and the floor being adequate. She thought about the calving barn at 2 in the morning and coming back to the lit window. That it happened, she said. That it actually happened. He looked at her. "What did you think would happen?" She thought about this honestly. "I thought I would survive it," she said. "I've survived most things. I thought I would come here and survive this too." She paused. "I didn't think I would." She stopped. "What?" She looked at the yard. "I didn't think I would want it," she said. "Not like this. Not this specifically. I didn't know you could want something that started the way this started." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You can want a thing that starts badly. You can want a thing that didn't start the way you would have chosen." He looked at her. The start isn't the thing. She thought about that. About starts and what they contain and what they don't. About the stage platform and Pruitt and the laughter. All the way the beginning had arranged itself into something that looked like evidence, like proof of a future that was already written. About how wrong it had been. About how wrong those beginnings had been. About everything that followed. There is something that wants to tell you who you are before you've had the chance to show it. It is not always a person. Sometimes it is a place. Sometimes a circumstance. Sometimes the accumulated weight of 100 small moments that have been arranged by other people's carelessness or cruelty into the shape of a verdict. And the most difficult and most necessary work of a life is to refuse that verdict, not with argument, not with performance, just with the continuing, ordinary, unremarkable act of being what you actually are, in front of it, in spite of it, until the days themselves become the answer. That is what Elara Voss had done. She had not arrived in Red Hollow as a story about triumph or transformation. She had arrived as a tired woman with a suitcase and a lifetime of other people's opinions and the specific practical courage of someone who has no other options but forward. And forward had turned out to be here. This kitchen, this yard, this family, this man standing beside her at the window on a June evening with the light going gold. She looked at the lanterns Eli had strung. She thought about the boy who had stood in the schoolyard and told his classmates to shut up. She thought about Rose's hand in hers that afternoon. The small weight of it, the certainty of it, the way the child had simply reached and held on, as though it were the most natural thing, as though there were no question of whether the hand would be there. Bram put his hand over hers on the windowsill. She turned hers over and held it. Outside, the Wyoming evening continued its long, unhurried progress toward dark. The light changing on the ranch, in the way light changes on things that have been there, long enough to be changed by the house, and the yard and the fence posts and the lanterns still swaying slightly in the last of the day's wind. And inside the kitchen, the lamp needed trimming, and the bread from the morning was still on the rack, and somewhere in the house a child was sleeping, who had stopped eating and started again, who had stopped singing and started again, and a boy was sleeping who had spent a year in sideways anger, and had found something to aim it at that was not himself, and a woman was standing at the window of her own kitchen in her own house, holding the hand of the man she had married, who had come to meet her on a stage platform on her worst day, and had not looked away. She was not who she had been in September. She was not transformed. She did not believe in transformation, in the clean narrative of the person who was broken and is now fixed. She was the same person she had always been, made of the same stubbornness and practicality, and the capacity to endure that had been formed in her long before Wyoming. She was just in the right place for those things to be what they actually were, rather than what other people had needed them to be. That was enough. That was in fact more than she had let herself hope for. The lamp needed trimming, she would do it in a minute. For now she stood at the window and held the hand that was holding hers and watched the light go from gold to amber on the ranch that was hers, that she had earned in the only way you earn anything real, by showing up and staying and doing the work, one ordinary day at a time until the days themselves became home.